Okay, good evening, everyone. Go ahead and find your seats. We do expect people to be filing in over the course of the next hour or so because it is still early evening. We are live streaming on Facebook, so and that will be posted later on. So anyone that's missed part of the meeting, you can always tell them they can catch up on that later on. So let them know. And
do a sound check.
it's not. I'm hearing myself. Can everyone hear in the back? Where's our sound guy?
The speaker's working, it just needs to be louder.
Yeah. I'm looking for our tech. It's going up. Oh, okay. There you go. Is that better? Can folks hear? We good? In the back? You okay? You can hear? Okay. My name's Doug Sarno. This is Christy Selko. We're going to be facilitating tonight, really helping to try to keep the meeting moving along. There is a lot to cover. And so we want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to get the information they're here for and ask the questions that the community has compiled. We'll explain how that's going to go here in a second. This meeting is a result of a lot of people's hard work. A lot of people in the community as well as EPA and the state have been meeting over the past couple of months to talk about how to make this meeting as effective as we can, get the information that people need moving forward. The purpose is to cover a couple of key things. One is that there are four reports about the Willowbrook site, studies and reports, and we'll talk about what they are here in a moment, and you'll hear presentations on those. We want to get those results out there so people can hear about them, and we'll have some back and forth with stakeholders. We also want to talk about the next steps for the national rule on commercial stabilizers from EPA, and also next steps for ETO sites here in Illinois as we move forward. So we'll be talking about all of that and having some stakeholder back and forth as well. Here's how the agenda will work. First of all, some introductions and welcome from the agencies who are here and local officials. And then we're going to jump right into presentations on those four different reports that we talked about. And following that, we'll have a stakeholder Q&A panel. And Christy will talk about in a second how those panels will work. But because there's not time to hold a formal, regular public hearing where everybody gets to step up to the microphone, we're having our questions asked by panels of stakeholders who've been working on this for quite some time, collecting information and questions from a variety of sources, and they'll be engaging the agency panelists on stage on behalf of the community. After that session, we'll go to the next step section on the regulations that are upcoming from EPA and next steps for Illinois, and then we'll have another Q&A panel that will ask those presenters about those two issues. And then we'll adjourn no later than 10 p.m. And take it from there. So I'll hand it over to Christy to talk a little bit about how those stakeholder interactions will work.
So tonight is going to be mostly an informational session. Doug says there's four separate, pretty big studies. And so what we're going to try to do is a combination of things, both a lot of information coming out, but then we have, as he noted, a diverse group really helped us put this meeting together. And frankly, a lot of folks from the community, both activists and local leaders, et cetera. And we said to him, now we can't have everybody ask detailed questions. How are we going to handle this? So what we did is we gathered questions in a number of different ways. They were submitted online. Some people submitted them here at the open house. Frankly, there's some questions that were still left from the last meeting that couldn't be answered at the time, frankly, because they didn't have the answers yet. The reports hadn't been finished. All those questions have been given to some panels that have been picked to ask questions tonight. So what you're going to see after we do like a presentation on a number of these studies, then we're going to bring up 4 or 5 community members, some local leaders, some organizational leaders, to kind of ask questions on behalf of the community. So that's the process that's going to go. We will not be able to take public questions tonight. There's frankly just too many people here. There's a number of people online. So the way it's going to work is using this process to kind of almost as surrogates for the community to ask the questions. We really appreciate the time these panels have put in to gathering these questions, reviewing them, and trying to make sure they can ask as many questions as possible. Even though we can't take general public comment tonight, there are a few ways to comment. In the past, as I said, we've gathered questions from EPA. We've, today at the open house, we're going towards the future. EPA is going to have a follow-on webinar. So if there's questions that aren't answered today, and you're going to hear some of the reports aren't quite finished, so to ask and get further information, there'll be a webinar. Anybody can ask questions there. And I know the state will also be having future activities. So there's a number of ways to still get additional information. So with that, we're going to begin with some short welcomes before we go to the more meat of the panel. We've asked each of the panelists to come on stage to just give a very brief introduction. This is also kind of a good representation of some of the people that were involved in the steering committee, so we appreciate their help and support from either their staff or from the members themselves. So, Ms. Stepp, if you'll introduce yourself and then lead it down the way. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. As you heard, my name is Kathy Stepp. I'm the Regional Administrator for EPA for Region 5. I'm located out of the downtown Chicago office. Those of you who were with us in Willowbrook back in August, I was at that meeting, and it certainly was a powerful moment for us. I'm here tonight representing our Region 5 team at EPA, and we've got many of our folks that are here, and I hope that a lot of you had opportunities to meet with them during the open house prior to this meeting started. For several months, our agency's scientists and engineers have done a tremendous amount of work to better understand ethylene oxide emissions, to understand the risks that they pose, and not just in this community, but certainly across the country as well. It's been a group effort indeed. We've worked side by side with our partners at Illinois EPA, who's joining us this evening, and with other federal, state, and local agencies, many of whom are here to talk with you tonight as well. So in the interest of time and making sure we get as much information to you as possible, I'm going to be introducing to you Bill Wareham, who is joining us from Washington, D.C. Bill is the head of EPA's AIR program. Many of you have spoken with him before because he has personally been very involved in this issue. He's an engineer and a lawyer and has more than 31 years of working in the environmental field through engineering, legal practice, and administrative duties. Again, thank you everyone for coming tonight, and here's Bill.
Thanks, Kathy. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here again and to reacquaint myself with many of you that I met last time around. As Kathy said, we will be brief. This is just introductions, and I will be presenting a little bit later this evening on some of the work we're doing on the regulatory front. But I wanted to say three things. One, first of all, thank you all for being here. The level of community engagement and involvement is really great to see. These are important issues. I know they touch you very deeply, and your participation in our ongoing work adds great value, and we very much appreciate that. Number two, I did want to be here personally, and you know, in some ways that's symbolic, but I think it's important symbolism. You know, I wanted to be here because I wanted you to know that we take these issues at EPA very, very seriously. I've personally spent a lot of time on this issue and a lot more time on this issue than I do on a lot of other nationally applicable issues. So these are that I take very seriously, and I know the agency does as well. So again, happy to have the opportunity to be here. Lastly, I just want to offer thanks to the folks who helped organize the meeting. A meeting like this takes a lot of effort. When it looks seamless, that means everything has gone right, and that's a product of a lot of hard work. And some of that was by my staff at EPA, and I very much appreciate that they're here, and others at EPA, including several key folks from Region 5, but also lots of assistance from the state of Illinois, from IEPA, from the AG's office, from the Department of Public Health, also from ATSDR. You'll be hearing from all these folks this evening, and from the community, who has had a seat at the table on the steering committee to organize our continued opportunities for engagement. So thank you for your work. I think this is a great meeting. I think it's going to go very well, and that's a product of a lot of effort. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Mayor Grasso of Burr Ridge.
Thank you, Bill. I'm Gary Grasso. I have the privilege of being the mayor of Burr Ridge. Welcome to our community for this very important forum. We say in Burr Ridge that we live in a very special place. And of course, it's my job and the job of the board to keep it a very special place. And we intend to do that. I want to recognize a few people that have worked very hard on this issue. A couple of our trustees are here, Tony Schiappa, Guy Francis, and also our Environmental Quality Commission people. Jennifer Hock, Jennifer McConaughey, Tom Layden, and Yvonne Mayer. I also bring greetings from Representative Jim Durkin and also State Senator John Curran. Of course, they are working hard for us down in Springfield, and they can't be here tonight. Let me just give you a couple of perspectives of where the village of Burr Ridge is coming from on this issue. As I said before, it's a very special place. And while we are sharing knowledge tonight, and we'd love to have this stay on the merits, I must tell you, as the leader of our community, that the primary purpose of government is to protect the public's health. That we are here with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to protect us. That I, as the mayor of this community, can see no way that a highly controlled situation can be allowed to exist. There is no legislation, there is no settlement, there is no Sterigenics. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor Grasso. Ladies and gentlemen, on August 22nd, 2018, the first time we were all together, or that was actually the 29th. On the 22nd, I read a letter from the ATSDR, which I had never heard of before, presenting a conclusion. The US EPA had reclassified ethylene oxide from possibly carcinogenic to carcinogenic. The ATSDR went on to say that there is sufficient evidence of a causal relationship between ETO and breast cancer in women. Unfortunately, the report was released without any clear explanation of its meaning, nor was Willowbrook or its residents provided with any certainty at what steps the government regulators would take in response to it. As mayor, I had no choice but to act, and it was imperative that Willowbrook resource the best experts to help us understand exactly what was known and what was unknown. Our task was to find the truth. And with the help of Minority Leader Jim Durkin, Senator John Curran, we immediately reached out to every elected official, both state and local. We were fortunate to have Congressman Foster, as well as Congressman Roscom, who were able to reach the US EPA in Washington, D.C. to share our concerns and our urgency. I'm not as gifted a speaker as the mayor from Burr Ridge, so you have to bear with me. The village quickly formed a task force headed by Trustee Gail Neal, who sought out the top experts in the nation and pulled them together with the leadership of Renee Cipriano, former head of the Illinois EPA. In addition to demanding answers and information, the village directed our air quality experts to quickly initiate testing, which led to more testing, this time both indoors and outdoors, and for a 30-day continuous period to better understand the levels of ethylene oxide in our air. This testing, along with EPA testing, have provided us with the US EPA, Illinois EPA, Illinois Attorney General, and the state's attorney's office with the data that it was needed. With this data in hand, it's my hope that the US EPA and Illinois EPA, Illinois Attorney General, DuPage County State's Attorney, Illinois Department of Public Health Board will continue to do everything in their power to protect our town with the authorities only they can afford us. I want to personally thank all of these agencies for stepping up their efforts to address the human health and environmental threat that our community has faced. A special thank you to the Illinois EPA and Illinois Attorney General for its efforts to give our town some relief as the experts review the data and provide us with better certainty for our future with the seal order. I also appreciate the US EPA's willingness to dedicate the needed resources to gather much needed air data and to review its meaning for Willowbrook residents. The village has gone to great expense, spent over $650,000 of our money to exact this unbiased data that we insist be used to help shape more protective ethylene oxide rules and regulations, not only locally, statewide, and nationwide. I can promise you that Willowbrook will continue to do whatever it takes, and we will not stop to protect our town. Sincerely, Frank Trill.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Good evening. My name is Margie Donnell.
I'm Netta Gajimanchus.
And we are here with Stop Sterigenics and Citizens for Clean Air. First, I want to say if you are one of the very few who have just recently realized that we have an issue facing ethylene oxide emissions in our communities, please, I urge you to go to www.stopsterigenics.com and you'll be fully up to date. Unfortunately, we did not have an opportunity to review the risk assessment before it was released today. This goes against the promise that Administrator Wheeler made to us in Washington, D.C. of full transparency. We would like to thank the EPA employees who have given so much of their time to talk to us and explain all the processes and walk us through the steps. But we are sorely disappointed in the leadership of the EPA. Despite your lack of transparency and refusal to release the risk assessment until the last minute, I assure you, we are prepared today. We are going to ask the questions whose answers we deserve.
I'm going to be more like the mom. I know that the emotions are going to be riding high. I know that what we're going to see here today is probably going to be like another bomb dropping on us. We do hope that we can get through all the comments and try to keep some of the booings and the applauses to a minimum. I know that it's hard not to do it because I'll probably be right there doing it with you guys at points. But we want to hear the answers from the people that are supposed to give us the answers. For all of you out there that are on the live stream right now, please know Sterigenics is not shut down. They are temporarily sealed, and we are here to ensure that they get shut down permanently and they can never do this again to another community.
Good evening. My name is Ngozi Ezike. I'm the director of the Illinois Department of Public Health. Our agency's priority is to protect the health and wellness of all residents of Illinois, and of course that includes the communities represented here. We understand that people have concerns, and I'm here tonight to hear those concerns and talk about the cancer study that my national expert researchers conducted. In 2018, when the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, ATSDR, recommended IDPH investigate whether there had been an increase in the number of people diagnosed with cancer, we immediately began an analysis of the data. We did analyze that data from the Illinois State Cancer Registry. This registry has been recognized as tops in the country. It has the highest level of certification for any cancer registry and has had that designation for over 20 years. Throughout the study period, IDPH did provide regular updates to Mayor Frank Tilla and the village of Willowbrook about the progress. Just a little overview about cancer studies. Of course, they are inherently complex. They are strictly data-based and they are created using statistical analysis. This study was an important step in better understanding the potential cancer risks that may be associated with ethylene oxide. So in this, our initial study to determine if there were increased cancer cases in the area, IDPH did find that some cancers were elevated. The study also found differences and some inconsistencies across the study areas between genders and among different types of cancers. My expert team will get into those in a little while. Of course, cancer is not just one disease, it's many different diseases with differing rates of occurrences, different risks, causes, and different chances of survival. Not everyone develops the same cancer for the same reason. It's an interaction of many different factors. Genetics plays a role, immunity, diet, occupation, and environment. As a result, it's hard for a single study to definitively prove that a particular exposure definitively caused a particular cancer. So because of the limits of a single study, IDPH will begin to design an additional research study to understand better the impact of ethylene oxide on cancers so that residents, legislators, everyone can have a more complete picture. We at IDPH, we are committed to making sure that residents and policymakers have accurate information in a timely manner moving forward. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is John Kim. I am the acting director for the Illinois EPA. I'd like to thank US EPA and the facilitators for inviting us to participate in this evening's meeting. It's of primary importance to us that as much information be presented to the public as possible. Before I took this job, before I took the position that I'm in right now, I knew, and our agency has known, that this is basically the primary focus for us, and it has been since the middle of January when I was appointed to the position. I easily spend 3/4 of every day working on just these issues. We are trying very hard to use every tool that we have available to try and address the situation, to try and bring as much relief as possible. We have taken steps, and we continue to work very closely with our partners in the best interests of the community. We have worked, for example, very closely with the legislators that were mentioned, that have been working tirelessly on legislation almost from the get-go. As a technical agency, we have provided them with background, with answers to their questions, and the current bill that has progressed the farthest along right now in the General Assembly, Senate Bill 1852, we work very closely with the sponsors and the proponents of that. Much of that legislation was written by our agency. So we take a keen interest in trying to make sure that any legislation that is adopted is going to be workable, it's going to be meaningful, and it's going to reach the purpose that was intended. We are also working very closely with our partners at the Illinois Attorney General's office and the DuPage County State's Attorney's office. There is pending litigation, 2 lawsuits that are still underway. We are, part of our job is, again, to provide technical assistance, to provide support, and to do whatever we can to make sure that those efforts are as strong as possible. Now, because of the fact that those 2 cases are still pending, and I cannot get into a lot of the information that I'm sure you're going to want to ask about, but to do so would jeopardize the nature of those cases, would jeopardize the state's position, and obviously that's a very big risk that I think is no one is willing to take. It would be a very bad idea. So I will answer as many questions as I can. I'll provide as much background as I can, but it goes without saying, because of the ongoing nature of the litigation, there are just going to be certain questions that I cannot answer. But I have personally spoken to several members of the public. I had an opportunity to meet with Margie and some of the members of Stop Sterigenics when they graciously took time out of their schedules to come down to Springfield to talk to us. And I read every email, every piece of correspondence that comes to our office. So, you know, it is not lost upon us. It's certainly not lost upon me the depth to which this is affecting you. And again, we are doing everything we can to try and bring relief to you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Please, quickly.
In addition to what Director Kim was just saying about the legislation, I was in Springfield this afternoon. 1852 made it through the Environmental Committee with no problems. We expect it to be voted on and approved tonight, if not tonight, tomorrow. We are hours, days at worst case scenario from having the toughest ethylene oxide legislation in the nation.
So thank you all. If I can get you all to step down, and the first set of presenters, please come on up to the podium. Stakeholders panel, stay seated for the moment. We're gonna go through all these first set of presentations at once, and so we can have a full hour of back and forth and question asking from the stakeholder panel when they come up. And Mike, I'll hand you this. Just forward. And you can use the podium or not. So EPA is going to give us an overview of the current state of information and the kinds of things that we'll talk about. And then we're going to walk through each of the 4 reports and studies that I talked about briefly earlier, which is the Illinois EPA well water sampling results, the EPA risk assessment, the ATSDR follow-up health consultation, and the Illinois DPH cancer study. So we'll have different speakers from each of those agencies come up and present. We'll start with Mike Herber from EPA.
Thank you, Doug. Can you hear me okay? No. No? No? Is that better?
No.
Yeah, better? Good. Check, check, check. Good. All right. Thank you. Well, I have the pleasure of kicking off our panel tonight with some very smart people, and I'll let you get to them as quickly as possible. But I wanted to start by saying thank you. Thank you to the villages, Mayor Trilla, Trustee Gay O'Neill, former village administrator Tim Halleck. Thank you for your support and your assistance. Thank you to the other government agencies who are up here tonight with me. You have people from the federal government, from US EPA and ATSDR. You also have people up here from state government. And you'll hear from all of us tonight. About this EPA thing, so you have US EPA, you have Illinois EPA, you have 2 EPAs here tonight. So just to clarify, I'm with federal EPA, US EPA. We set national emission standards for the entire country. So national standards, industry-wide, nationwide. You also have Illinois EPA here. They're the ones that deal with more local situations, such as what's happening in this community. They're the ones that issue air permits. So we each have different roles and responsibilities. We both implement the Clean Air Act, and we're both responsible for managing air quality. It is a federal-state partnership. So I'm federal, they're state. Just want to be clear about the different roles for federal and state EPA, since you'll hear from both of us tonight. I also want to thank the community for your engagement and your collaboration. So the timeline here gives you some indication of the work that we've been doing in this area since last fall. You'll hear about the monitoring that was done. I'll say a few words about that, but you'll hear more about that from an upcoming speaker. We've also done a risk assessment, and we've just released some of the preliminary results of that. And we have Kelly Reimer here from my office to talk more about that. We have people here from Illinois EPA to talk about the well study that was done. That'll actually be the next speaker. And then we have people here from the Department of Public Health to talk about their cancer incident study. All very important information for this area, for this community, to better characterize the nature of the problem here. Last fall when we had our meeting, we talked about our process for addressing your concerns. We said that process needed to be orderly. It needed to be scientific. We needed to do studies like this. and that it was going to take time. So we're here tonight to talk about what we've done, but we're also here to talk about what we still need to do. We're not there yet. We've made a lot of progress, but there's still some final steps that we all need to take. So the main takeaways from many talks you're going to hear tonight. First of all, you're going to hear about risks at recent levels, pre-seal order operating conditions for this facility. And we believe that those levels do require regulatory action. Federal EPA is going to be taking some action, but state EPA at some point, as Director Kim indicated, will also be taking some action. We believe that these risks that we are currently seeing for current conditions could be reduced if the facility was more highly controlled. Finally, you have our commitment that US EPA will work very closely with the state EPA to establish a protective control strategy prior to any reopening of the facility. So that's what I offer you tonight as our main takeaways. And I think many of the speakers will reinforce some of these messages. So just a couple of points here in terms of the air monitoring that was done. And again, you'll hear more about that from an upcoming speaker. We sampled in your community for 4.5 months, almost 50 days. Many of those days were before the seal order, but we also had 6 weeks after the seal order. So we have a lot of before and after information that's very interesting and give us some important information. Some of the main takeaways from all of that is when we look at the data over the 49 days, we see a lot of day-to-day variation. So weather conditions, meteorology make a big difference from one day to the next. We also see that the facility is responsible for a significant amount of ethylene oxide in this community. There's no doubt about that looking at the ambient data. Background levels do exist in this area. We are seeing low yet measurable concentrations. And we'll talk more about, perhaps in response to questions, what specifically we're doing to better understand sources of background ethylene oxide. And finally, the monitoring data did play a role in our risk assessment. It did help us better understand emissions from the facility. So we did use some of that information in doing some of our analytics. Kelly's going to talk about the risk assessment. She'll present a current pre-seal order situation, a scenario. And again, we believe that the risks associated with those current conditions do require regulatory action. We also look at an illustrative future scenario, and we believe that the risk can be very, very low if the facility was more highly controlled.
We're shut down.
Would you like to buy a house? Post it.
We've continued to engage with the community over the past 6 months. As you know, we have a website, and we've been trying to update that on at least a weekly basis, sometimes more frequently, to provide the latest information we have about some of the studies, but also some of the other work that's happening. We have a number of frequently asked questions, almost 100 on our website. We're going to get a lot more tonight. We're going to get some afterwards. We are committed to trying to answer as many of those as we can, if not all of them. And we've done a number of webinars. Whenever we've been posting monitoring data, we've been having webinars to discuss that information. We've done 6 of those. We've also done 3 other informational webinars to provide information about air toxics, how we do a risk assessment, and the public engagement process when we go through rulemaking, as EPA is going to be doing in just a few months. Finally, what's coming up? And you're going to hear more about this from Bill and Director Kim in the next panel session. We're working on a national rule for commercial sterilizers. We have a current rule, and we've committed to going back and relooking at that, making sure that the technology that's required is state-of-the-art and meets the requirements of the Clean Air Act. We're also under a 2-pronged approach for addressing ethylene oxide nationally, looking at individual communities such as this one. But this isn't the only one in which we are looking at and working very closely with state air agencies, with local communities, with affected facilities to try to tailor solutions to those individual areas. Understand that our national rule is just that. It's a national rule. It reflects the industry from a very broad perspective. To get a solution tailored to an individual community you need local leadership, such as what Illinois EPA is presenting here. And you need that tailored, focused solution in order to get risk to a level that everybody says is acceptable. And finally, we have ongoing technical work. We need to improve the monitoring methods. We said when we started monitoring that there were a lot of limitations with the current monitoring techniques, and there still are. We need to improve upon those, and we're doing research, and we'll continue to do research to improve upon that. We want to understand sources of background in the area. That is an important task for us, and it's something that we are actively pursuing. We want to improve the emissions inventories as well. And we have some national emission inventories that need a lot of work for air toxics, but it's something we're committed to improving. So that's some of the technical work ahead of us. We have regulatory work ahead of us. You'll be hearing more about some of the regulatory work from the next panel. But I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to turn over to the next presenter, which I believe will be Brad.
Hi, so I'm Brad Frost, the manager of the Office of Community Relations at the Illinois EPA. I was asked to speak here tonight briefly about the well study that we did last year. There was, yeah, I speak kind of loudly. Okay. So we were hearing a lot of concern in the community about the impacts of potential impacts about ethylene oxide and ethylene glycol on private wells in the area. So while our scientific and technical knowledge wouldn't suggest to us that the airborne ethylene oxide or the ethylene glycol at the facility would impact private wells, out of an abundance of caution, we devoted resources to doing a study within a mile radius of the facility to sampling private wells. So DuPage County Health Department, which the county health departments are the ones that keep private well records and installation of private wells, helped us out and went out and got access agreements for us. We did private so we sampled for ethylene oxide and ethylene glycol in 55, in all of the wells that were within the mile radius that we received access agreements for. And as we expected, every single well came back as a non-detect for both ethylene oxide and ethylene glycol. So anyone that had their well tested would have received a letter from the Department of Public Health, but they were all non-detect. One thing I do want to say, and I say this whenever I'm talking to people that have private wells, is that every year you should get your well tested for both bacteria and nitrates. Those are common contaminants in private wells, and that's a service that for a nominal charge the County Department of Public Health will provide to you. So, thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Kelly?
Yeah, I think so. My slides? Okay, right. Is that, okay. Hi, again, my name is Kelly Reimer, and I work in the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards at EPA. My office does risk assessments for the air toxics program, and we also did the National Air Toxics Assessment that some of you folks may have heard about. I'm here today to talk about the assessment that we did on the Sterigenics facility, specifically the ethylene oxide emissions that are coming out of that facility and the potential impacts on the community. So what we'll cover this evening, I'm first going to go over a couple of key terms, and just so we're on the same page with some of the risk assessment language or lingo that we use. Then I'm going to walk through the assessment, what we examined, the geographical area that the assessment covered, and because a risk assessment is an estimate of future risks, there's always limitations to the study and there's always uncertainties around that study. So every time we talk about a risk assessment and explain it, we always include an understanding of what the limitations are and what the uncertainties are. And then after I go through that, I will finish with a review of the results. Before I start, though, I do want to reiterate what Mike said. When we looked at both the pre-seal order, scenario, it's clear, and you'll see it from the slides, that those risks need some regulatory action. We also looked at the futures case scenario, and those risks could become lower, and we'll walk through that as well. So a couple of key terms. So what are air toxics? Air toxics are pollutants that are known or suspected to cause cancer or other irreversible serious health issues. We are required by the Clean Air Act to regulate those pollutants at emission sources. We are required to say how much can a facility emit of these pollutants. You may be more familiar with ozone or particulate matter, where EPA sets a limit, a concentration in the air that can't be exceeded. The air toxics program is different. The EPA in this program tells the facilities how much they can emit from the plant. So it's a different, two very different ways of handling air pollution. We just want to be clear that the air toxics regulates at the source. It doesn't regulate the outdoor air. Ethylene oxide, of course, is one of those pollutants. So the next term I want to clarify is cancer risk. So what is cancer risk? Essentially, it's the chance of getting cancer from breathing, for example, an air pollutant. In this case, that air pollutant is ethylene oxide. So in this case, cancer risk means the risk of getting cancer from breathing ethylene oxide over a long period of time. We describe risks usually in terms of numbers like 1 in a million or 10 in a million. So 1 in a million risk means that for every million people who are exposed to the same pollutant at the same level for the same amount of time, one person out of that million would get a cancer. If we say the risk is 100 in a million, that means that out of those million people who, again, are exposed to that same pollutant at the same concentration for that same period of time, 100 people might get cancer from that. So that's just some of the terminology we use in conducting risk assessments. When we get to the maps, you'll see that the areas that we covered in the risk assessment include Willowbrook, Burr Ridge, Hinsdale, Darien, Indian Head Park, and Western Springs. So it covers several of the communities in this general area. And we evaluated two scenarios, as Mike indicated before. We looked at the pre-seal order scenario. So what that was the emissions that the facility was emitting, emissions of ethylene oxide that the facility was emitting after July 2018, when the back vent was reconnected, up until the seal order, so that period of time. We also looked at potential risks, assuming emissions from the facility are more highly controlled, and this is an illustration, we call it the future case, or the illustrative future case. And so what we did for this is, we don't know what the future of Sterigenics is going to be. We don't know under what circumstances it may or may not open again. But we wanted to look into and examine whether or not those risks could be reduced if there were more controls put on the facility. So how we did that is we took a look at what we know about the Sterigenics facility. As Mike indicated, we're doing a national rule, and as part of that national rule, we're getting information on many facilities, all the facilities all over the country. So we know about Willowbrook's, how they're structured, how their emissions work, how they're configured, so we have that information. What we also did was we looked to the Medline draft permit, not for the same numbers that is in that permit. They're very different facilities, very different circumstances. But we looked to see what kinds of controls Illinois is requiring of that facility. And so, for example, in that permit is raise the stack. That's one thing. Another thing is reduce the emissions, which means reducing actually how much ethylene oxide the facility can use. The third thing is make sure that there's no leaks of emissions that come anywhere from other than just the stack, which is controlled. We don't want any uncontrolled leaks out of windows or vents or doors. And there's a technique called negative pressure, which we can talk about more later, where all the airflow goes into the center of the building, and therefore there's no possibility for leaks, and that's an important consideration. And then the last consideration is making sure that the control mechanisms are operating at their optimal level. So we took those 4 principles and applied those to a future case, and we'll show you the results of that future case in just a second. So we made some assumptions in the scenarios. We did a couple of different kinds of estimates. We looked at the risk to the population for people who live around the facility. And when we do that, we made the assumption that somebody's going to be breathing that same level of pollution for 70 years. So it's a long exposure, kind of a health protective exposure. We also looked at areas where workers, people who work close to the facility, not on the facility site, but people who work in different areas close into the Sterigenics facility. For the people for where people live, as I said, we assume 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 70 years, constantly breathing, essentially never leaving your porch. And for the workers, we use the same parameters as the ATSDR folks, our colleagues up here, when they did their report last summer, when they looked at workers around the vicinity, about 8.5 hours a day, 5 days a week, about 50 weeks a year, all the way out to about 25 years. So those are the 2 scenarios that we looked at: residents and people who work in the area. So limitations and uncertainties are a couple of really important things to keep in mind that helps us understand the results a little bit better. First of all, as I said, this assessment focuses on the risks only from the Sterigenic facility, only from ethylene oxide. It doesn't include anybody in the community's exposure to other kinds of pollutants from cars or other facilities, and it doesn't include other exposures from ethylene oxide itself. This assessment is designed to say, what is the Sterigenics contribution to the community's risk from breathing ethylene oxide? So that's important to keep in mind, just Sterigenics risks. The risk assessment and risk assessment in general can provide general estimates of a population's risks of getting cancer. It's not designed to provide an individual an indication of whether or not they're going to get cancer. My chance of getting cancer is dependent on many, many factors. It's dependent on how much of a pollutant I'm breathing, my age, my gender, my general health status, my access to health care, my genetics, my lifestyle. So that's way too many parameters to try to, science cannot predict an individual person's getting cancer. Risk assessment is a very good tool for understanding the potential cancer risks in an area to a larger population, but it doesn't address individual risks. The last thing that is important to keep in mind before we get to the results, and we're almost there, is that these risks are more likely, the risk assessment is more likely to overestimate the risks than underestimate the risks. We don't want to underestimate the risks when we're making a determination of how much air pollution needs to be reduced. So we make sort of health protective assumptions. For example, I referred to the fact that we're assuming that somebody is breathing these pollutants for 70 years. Most people don't stay in one place for 70 years, but we want to make sure that we're being health protective in making the assumptions about how much people are exposed for. So we go all the way up to 70 years. All right, so now I think we're getting to the results. This slide is busy, and I'm going to stay on it just for a second. The left-hand side photo is the pre-seal conditions, and you can see, can people see the little red thing? I wish I could be a little closer. So the colored circles down in that bottom of it represent the higher risks. Well, I don't want to lose those guys, would I? Well, we'll try from here. So the idea of this slide is you can see that there are higher risks here, and this is the pre-seal order conditions. And then with the illustrative future case, those risks are dramatically reduced, and we'll walk through that in a second.
What will be your pointers?
You guys are, thank you very much, my esteemed colleagues. So we want to zoom in. I want to explain how to read this slide. So let's start in the middle. If you can see in the middle, there's a square and a rectangle, and those represent Sterigenics Facility 1 and Facility 2 in Willowbrook. You'll notice also in that center, there's a crosshatch area. Because this is looking at residential lifetime risks, we didn't calculate anything in that area because nobody lives there. The first place that people live is in that sort of blue ring right there. So the maximum risk is on the inside of that blue ring, and that's about 1,000 in a million. Go closer to the facility, Kristen. Yeah. Yeah, so that ring where Sarah's over here, that's about the 1,000 in a million risk level. And the width of that, you can go out, when you go out to the width of that, it's about down to 500. So that blue patch, that blue circle is 1,000 in a million down to 500 in a million. And that's about 1/3 of a mile away from the facility. The next level is about 500 in a million down to a 2,000, 500 in a million down to 200 in a million risk. And that goes out about a mile from the facility. The brown area is 200 in a million down to about 100 in a million, and that goes about 1.5 miles out from the facility. The area out here, the gray background area, it represents risks that are 100 in a million or less. And of course, as you're closer to the brown area, the gray, as the gray beats the brown, it's more closer to 100 in a million, and as you move out, it's closer down toward 1 in a million. So we're gonna back up a little bit to show you a little bit more of the area. So you can see we've zoomed out a little bit, and you can see we've got, I guess, Western Springs up there, we've got Burr Ridge, Indian Head Park, Hinsdale, Darien, and Willowbrook there in the center. So this is the area. Western Springs is maybe about 5 miles. You guys know better than I do. Away from the.
I just have one question for what people were asking. Why isn't it scaled out? Who made that decision to have it scaled out to 6 miles?
This is about 6 miles out, about 5 miles out. The purpose. Right. The purpose of this, we were trying to show you guys your community in a way where you could actually see the picture from the seat. If we had zoomed out more, it would be even harder to see the details. So I'm going to try to talk through those details, and I appreciate your point. We're trying to balance you guys being able to see what we're talking about and giving you guys all the information that you want and you need. So if you're looking at Willow Spring, is about 5 miles away, and that risk around there is around maybe 10 in a million. You go another mile and it's down to 1 in a million. So the risks close in, within 1.5 miles, go from 1,000 in a million down to 100 in a million. That's at 1.5 miles. And then at 6 miles, it's down to 1 in a million. So there's a gradient. It's high, much higher, of course, in that center area than it is about 6 miles out. This is just an example of the risks if that scenario, the illustrative future case were to happen. Those risks are well below 100 in a million, on the order of below 10 in a million, and maybe lower. So that's the residential case. This is the occupational. This is the case where the folks are working around the facility. So again, you can see that the risks are higher on the left-hand side in the pre-seal and lower in the future case. So walking through this, again, we've got the Willowbrook 1 and 2, the facilities there. This risk, this blue area, again, is the risk of 1,000 in a million down to 500 in a million. And it's just a coincidence that the highest risk for the resident and the highest risk for the person who works in that area are 1,000 in a million. They could have been different. It just happens that they're both 1,000 in a million. So the 1,000 in a million area is that blue patch. Then it's the 500 in a million down to 200 in a million is that yellowish, beigeish patch. And then the out to the rest of it is that's the 200 to 100 in a million. And that's all within, I think it's about 1/4 mile. So that's a very tight area of the risk. And then it goes about, when you're about 4 miles, 4.5 miles out, you're all the way down to 1 in a million. So this is again the estimate of the future case, and those risks are again much closer to 1 in a million than 100 in a million. And so that's the brief run through of the risk assessment. The risk report will be a few weeks out. It'll be posted when it's done. We'll have these slides and more slides in there. And also there's going to be a follow-up webinar that ATSDR and us we will do in the future, and we can continue to discuss the results of the risk assessment and answer more questions. Thank you.
So 100 million is 1 in 10,000?
It is.
And so then the 1,000 million is 1 in 1,000?
Yeah. No, it's not.
Could you, actually, Kelly, could you repeat that for folks so that they...
Oh yeah, sorry. So she was saying that 100 in a million is 1 in 10,000. Right, and she says that's a more relatable number, which, yeah, that's fair. Right.
Okay. No, I'm sorry, I am going to have to step in. So we really want to get all this information out. We have a stakeholder panel ready and geared up with questions, and they... Yeah, no, I get that, but I think that what we want to do is have you see the big picture so you can see what ATSDR has to say and what the cancer study has to say, and then we'll go back and look at it as a whole with the questions. And if you feel like you don't understand it, the stakeholder panel can check in with you and get those clarifications.
Okay, I'm going to try to find my sweet spot so you can hear me. Can everybody hear me? Is this all right? Okay. I'm Michelle College. I'm here. Mark Johnson is the regional director of ATSDR. I work in his office in downtown Chicago. ATSDR stands for the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. Mayor Trillis said he's never heard of us before. We are kind of within the umbrella of the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, which a lot of people do recognize, which is under the umbrella of the Department of Health and Human Services. All of that is to say that I'm in a federal public health agency. So we were invited into this issue by EPA Region 5. They asked us to evaluate data that they had measured and modeled in Willowbrook, and I'm going to talk briefly about that, just kind of remind some of you who may not know about that assessment from last summer, and then talk to you a little bit about the information that we're evaluating right now and the assessment that we have ongoing right now. Unfortunately, we just don't have our final conclusions and recommendations that we can tell you tonight, but we will be talking about the data that we're going to be basing those conclusions and recommendations on. And we'll talk a little bit about our next steps as well. So last spring, EPA Region 5, they had some measured data and modeled data and it was associated with the NADA assessment that they generated for different sterilizers and different ETO emitting facilities across the US. One that was in our region that they asked us to look at was Sterigenics here in Willowbrook, over there in Willowbrook. And they had measured data and modeled data, and they were asking for our technical guidance on what those data mean. Our agency does evaluate environmental data to look at the health impacts on the communities that live near these facilities, and we provide technical public health assistance to communities, to agencies at the local, federal, and state level, as well as to elected officials if they have questions for us and sites of interest to their constituents. So this is an instance where EPA Region 5 asked for us to provide that public health assistance to them, so we evaluated the data. We had a very limited data set of measured readings. We only had a couple days of ethylene oxide measurements in the community, but we did have a model that kind of was estimating a longer term exposure scenario. So looking at those data, we had, our two conclusions were that it was unlikely that non-cancer effects, acute effects would result from the exposures or the concentrations that were measured in the community. But we did have some concerns about the potential cancer risks that we were seeing that were resulting from the measured and modeled data. So we made some recommendations. We made 3 major recommendations. The first one was we wanted the regulatory agencies to work with the company to try to reduce their emissions into ambient air. So pretty quickly after that, the back vents were tied into the pollution control system. We also asked that EPA consider doing a longer-term investigation of the ETO in the community's air so that we could get a better sense of how well the limited data we had represented more of a long-term exposure scenario. And that actually, many of you realize that started in November and then it went through the end of March. That is the basis of what we'll be basing our health call on with the new assessment, the follow-up assessment that we're conducting currently. And then the last recommendation we made was that we can model cancer, and but the real telling thing would be to look at whether or not it's actually happening, whether or not it's actually occurring at higher levels, higher incidences. We call it, when something is occurring, it's an incident. So in epidemiology, we call it cancer incidence when it's happening. So we wanted to look and see if the cancer incidence was higher near the facility than further away. So we asked Illinois Department of Public Health to do that. So they did complete their assessment. It was released at the end of March, and they're going to talk about that next. So with our new assessment, we had this assessment before. We said there could be an elevated risk. We asked for more information to be collected. Now we have that information, so our new assessment, we're evaluating that data set as well as a bunch of other data sets. We try to pull in the data from the city of Willowbrook, the city of Burr Ridge collected data. We have the EPA data set. We looked at data collected by the facility around the Chicagoland area. We also pulled data that we could find from other states where they measured ethylene oxide in ambient air, as well as there were some that were historic, so they're older data. Then we have some that were collected last year as a result of evaluations of other sterilizers. For example, in Colorado and Michigan, we have those data as well. So we tried our best to gather all of the ethylene oxide data that we could find across the United States to look at here in our assessment as well. We wanted to look at how the ethylene oxide varies over space and time, as well as the influence of weather conditions on the exposures in the community. So we evaluated all of those factors in our assessment, and we wanted also to calculate risks that are associated with those concentrations in the community. The background piece, we don't like to call it background because ethylene oxide is not a naturally occurring pollutant. It was just really important for us to get a handle on what is a baseline ethylene oxide concentration and what additional risk does Sterigenics contribute to the already present risk that you have from ETO that's in ambient air anyway. So these are the data sets in the community. So the top row is the data that we looked at last year for the assessment that we released last July. It was in a letter to EPA Region 5. It was a technical letter that was evaluating the data that they gave us to review. And then our new assessment, like I mentioned, is based on the EPA data that were collected from November 13th through March 31st in the last, it was about 5 months of data. Altogether, we have about 500 observations to look at to evaluate air quality data in Willowbrook and in around Willowbrook. And then the preliminary summary of the data, and again, this is just the EPA data. We relied on the EPA data a little more heavily because it's serial data. We call it serial data. That means it was collected in one location over a period of time. And that gives us a better ability to evaluate the fluctuations in the data over time and to look at trends and to really understand what's going on in a point in the community. So in this table, there's a lot more statistics that are presented in our document that you'll see when it's completed. But The row on the left that's red, or the column, is the 50th percentile concentrations at each of these monitoring locations before the facility was closed on February 16th. And the column on the right with the red numbers is the 50th percentile concentration of ETO when the facility was closed. In general, we like to look at, when we're comparing different data sets, sometimes the median or the 50th percentile statistic is a little more reliable because sometimes averages are really skewed by really high concentrations or really low concentrations. So this is a little bit more stable when we're comparing different data sets. But what you'll see is that when Sterigenics is operating, those median concentrations are between 2 and 10 times higher than when Sterigenics is not operating. In that range, obviously we're going to have different risks in different parts of the community, so the closer monitors, as Kelly mentioned, not only are they modeled to be higher, but they're the measurements we see that decrease from distance from the site as well. So this is really hard to see in this giant room, but I'm going to zoom in on one of these clusters of sites. But these are all the monitoring locations. It's really hard to see this here, but they're color coded. So the yellow ones are all to the west and northwest of the facility. These little black boxes are the facility over here. I don't have my handy colleagues pointing them out, but so this is Sterigenics, the buildings 1 and 2. So on the left side, we are showing the time trends of ETO at each of the monitors to the west of the site. So if you can't really see it very well, but this is concentration over time. So and then this blue line that goes vertical is when the company was sealed. So there's a couple of really important things to show you here. And I'm going to zoom in on this, but just to show, when we looked at the clustered data, we call it clusters because they're spatially in the same direction from the site. So the ones in yellow are to the west-northwest, the ones in blue are to the southwest. So over here, it's hard to see, down, that would be Gower Middle and the warehouse monitor. And then the pink ones are to the north, so that's the water tower and the Willow Pond Park sites. But no matter which direction you're looking, you see that the ones on the top are the closest sites and the ones on the bottom are further away. Regardless of what direction we go, all roads are pointing to Sterigenics for the elevated ETO. So as you move away from the site, the concentrations decrease, and you also notice that when they are closed, those concentrations stabilize and they're not getting those high fluctuations anymore. So the company, when we see trends that look very similar except they get smaller and smaller, that means that they all are coming from a common source in general. Now if I move in and show you a little closer what this looks like, then you can see again, these are the ones to the west. We see that the concentrations are dropping off pretty quickly as we move away from the facility. And again, we see this stabilizing of concentrations of ETO after the seal order has been issued.
Yay for science!
Now, we did a lot of statistical analysis of this. That's kind of like way more than I can talk about in 15 minutes. But one thing we did is we looked at how the data in the sites compare to each other. And an example would be, we looked at how different Gower Elementary and Hinsdale High's data were from each other. Both of them are more similar to each other than they are to obviously the West neighborhood or to the Village Hall site. So again, this is just showing that there's a common source, and as you move away, then that impact gets less and less. This is another interesting way to show data. We like to show data because it helps us explain it better. It's kind of hard to see these. These are called polar plots. So we're looking at, these are each of the blue dots is one of the air monitoring locations. And I can't really see when I point over here. So these two are Village Hall and the warehouse, and the black boxes again are Sterigenics buildings 1 and 2. And what these plots show you is concentration by wind direction and wind speed. So the blue concentrations are closer to less than 1, and then we move all the way up to 7 micrograms. So what these show you, they're actually pointing at the source. So the red, the higher concentrations are showing when the wind direction is coming from that direction. So for example, I'm gonna move and show you a close-up. So these again are the clustered sites to the west, and what this shows is we see the influence of, in this picture is building 2. You see the red, that's getting up to 7 micrograms. That's pointing at these 2 sources, these 2 buildings. You see a little less signal here and even less as you move further away. Now, if I'd chosen a different scale, then we would have, we might have seen, we might still see something further out, but when we go up to 7 micrograms, we see the strong influence of the facility on the closer sites. And that's the case when we look to the north as well. So this is the water tower, so you still see that signal pointing at the facility, as well as when we look at the Gower Middle and the facility to the southeast of the site. One thing that's interesting to note here is that in this range, we are not seeing the influence of mobile sources of the highway. I know that's an area of investigation right now, is how much does mobile sources, how much do they contribute to ambient air quality. But in this range of concentration, the higher concentrations are clearly associated with the facility.
Thank you.
And then one last real quick, because this is really important because it may kind of lead to other investigations down the road. When we look at ethylene oxide in other places, other states, we tried to pull, again, this is when I was talking about all the other data sources we looked at. When we tried to look at other areas where they've collected or they've analyzed the organic samples for ETO, we are trying to identify what might be some kind of baseline risk across the US. And we have limited data now. I know that there will be more coming, but what this shows is that we have data from New England, from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. We have data from some investigations in Colorado and Michigan where they have background and upwind data. And we have the Sterigenics collection of data across the Chicagoland area. We also have our data collected when the facility was not operational as well. At the bottom, you're seeing the concentrations when the company is operating compared to all these data collected in other places that don't have a sterilizer nearby. So what we're seeing is that there's a baseline risk wherever ETO has been analyzed for, and it's within this certain range that you're seeing here. And this certain range is where we're at when Sterigenics is closed down. So what we see now is pretty typical of other data sets we've evaluated in other places. So our next steps is we're going to finish our document. We hope to do that in the next month or two, hopefully sooner the better. We know everyone's really wanting to see it and we want to release it. So as soon as we can, we'll do that, and we'll make sure there's a forum for you to ask questions and to have us explain it a little better if you need clarification on anything. In that assessment, we'll also be summarizing IDPH's cancer incidence review, and we'll continue to work with all of you and other communities that have ETO and ambient air to help you assess risks and find health protective activities to move you into a healthier community.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you all for your patience to allow us to get this big picture out there. Our last speaker is going to talk about the cancer study.
Good evening, everybody. I'm not quite as seasoned a public speaker as everybody that's come before me. I prefer to use notes and podiums, so I apologize. My name's Kyle Garner. I'm a cancer epidemiologist with the Illinois Department of Public Health, and I'm here to talk to you tonight about the results of our cancer incidence assessment near the Sterigenics facility in Willowbrook, Illinois, which covered the years 1995 through 2015. The research question in this investigation was, is there evidence of increased cancer incidence in the area surrounding the Sterigenics facility? In order to answer that question, we first had to construct a study area. Our first study area was constructed using 2010 census tracts. Census tracts were selected based on their proximity to the Sterigenics facility, as well as overlap with the EPA modeled ETO concentrations. Census tracts were also used because in a study like this, we are in dire need of population data, and census tracts gave us that population data. We created a second study area that, again, out of 2010 census tracts, and this was created to approximate the 60527 zip code, and as well as provide us some input with a second study area. We can compare the results of the first and second study areas and look for any differences between the two. The data source for this study was from the Illinois State Cancer Registry. This was a population-based registry in Illinois, covers all Illinois residents. The time period for this analysis was a 21-year time period, 1995 through 2015. This was the most recent and most complete time period that the cancer registry had available. Cases were geocoded to the census tract level. In the first study area, there were 4,534 cancer cases. In the second study area, there were 9,416 cancer cases. And cases were stratified by sex, age, and tumor site. The sites that we examined were the lymphohematopoietic cancers, blood cancers. They included Hodgkin's lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, myeloma, and lymphocytic leukemia. We also examined female breast cancer. Now this group of cancers was of particular interest given the association with ethylene oxide that was established in workplace studies. We also examined 18 other common cancer sites, such as colorectal cancer, lung cancer, bladder cancer, that are routinely examined in any cancer investigation that the department conducts. And we also examined pediatric cancers. The specific sites for those are on the slide. I'm not going to go through those in the interest of time. We utilized standardized incidence ratios to compare our study area, or the observed cancer cases, with the reference groups, or the expected cancer cases. In this study, we utilized two reference groups, or two comparison groups. The first one we called the state reference group, which included the counties of Lake, McHenry, Kane, DuPage, and Will, and a second comparison group, which was the county of DuPage. For years that were non-censal years, we interpolated and extrapolated our population counts based on a linear model. The standardized incidence ratios were indirectly age-adjusted, and observed expected comparisons were made for all sex and site-specific combinations. Statistical significance for this test was set at the 0.05 level, and we also did examine the data for a trend over time. We split our study period into 3 7-year groups and examined trends in ETO-related cancer sites. This table shows the SIRs for our first and second study areas compared to the state and county reference groups for males and females for the ETO-associated cancers. Hodgkin's lymphoma was seen to be significantly elevated in study area 1 when compared to the county as well as the state reference groups. And female breast cancer was significantly elevated in study area 1 and 2 when compared to the state reference group. So lymphohematopoietic cancers, there were no elevations that were seen in males. Hodgkin's lymphoma was, as I said, significantly elevated among women in study area 1, roughly 86% higher when compared to the county, and 89% higher when compared to the state. Few prior studies have focused on the relationship between this particular cancer site and ethylene oxide exposure. Female breast cancer did appear to be elevated compared to the 5 collar counties. It's roughly 10% higher than expected in study area 1 and 7% higher than expected in study area 2. However, this was not significantly higher when compared to the county of DuPage, the entire county. One possible explanation for this is that DuPage County has had historically some of the highest breast cancer rates in the state when you look at it by county. So it is possible that DuPage County has as a whole elevated breast cancer rates, and it's not specific to these particular study areas. That's one possible explanation. We did examine trends in ETO-related cancer sites. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in females increased over time with a significant SIR in 2009-2015. And that is this section right here, this cluster of bars. There were no other sites that displayed a clear negative or positive trend over time. Other cancer sites that we examined in males, prostate cancer was significantly elevated in both study areas when compared to the state and county reference groups. Lung cancer was significantly lower in men of study area 2. In females, pancreatic, ovarian, and bladder cancers were elevated in study area 1. Pancreatic cancer was elevated in study area 2 as well. And leukemia was significantly lower in study area 1. And lung cancer was significantly lower in study area 2 compared to the state reference. We did examine pediatric cancer, and we did observe that lymphomas in females were elevated in both study areas 1 and 2 when compared to the state reference group. We do need to keep in mind that pediatric cancer and the other common cancer sites, those are sites that have not been examined in the literature, and prior studies really haven't shown us any evidence of a relationship between those particular cancer sites.
That's true. That's not true. I'm a cancer biologist. That's not true. I found cases myself. They know that the lymphomas and breast cancers are caused by ethylene oxide mutations, DNA lesions.
Yes.
They're testable.
And but that's not what I said. What I said was the other common cancer sites, the non-ETO related sites, and pediatric cancers specifically. So in conclusion, some cancers were seen to be elevated in this study: Hodgkin's lymphoma and breast cancer in females. These results should be treated with caution, as this was the first time that a population-based registry was used to examine this issue. We did, in our own study, see inconsistencies across gender, study areas, and cancer sites. When we interpret these results, we do need to keep in mind many study limitations specific to this study. We did make many comparisons in this study, which raises a chance of false positive findings. We did utilize imprecise population figures. The cancer registry does provide some residential history. However, it is a snapshot of residents at the time of diagnosis, so we don't have information on cancer cases prior to cancer diagnosis. And we did utilize residing near a facility as a proxy for ethylene oxide exposure, We were unable to actually test individuals to see if they were exposed to ethylene oxide. Some comparisons in this study were based on small numbers, which increases the variability in the rates that those numbers are based on, and thus lowers the ability to researchers to detect differences. We didn't have any other additional data on other risk factors for cancer, so we could include and control for those in our study. And finally, cancer is a very complex disease. It begins in a very complex way with environment, genetics, and health behaviors certainly all playing a role. We recommend that the Illinois State Cancer Registry continue to monitor cancer incidence in Willowbrook, Illinois, with continued data collection in the future. Future data collection will allow for an assessment of incidence following operational changes of ETO emitters in the area, and we strongly recommend that future studies be completed that incorporate larger populations so we don't encounter some of the study limitations that I mentioned, and also multiple ETO emitters. Thank you for your time, everyone. If you have any questions, you can send them to ethyleneoxide-cancer@illinois.gov.
Can you stress specifically how people who have moved out of the area and their diagnosis is reported in different counties?
So guys, let's wait for 1 minute, because we have a number of folks that have gathered questions. So if you could hold, what I'd like to do is...
No, I'd like this answered, thank you.
No, hold on 1 second. So if you guys could all move down, and we can bring up the panelists that are community members that have gathered questions from a lot of people. I want to be respectful of who's offered their questions and put them forth. And if we just make it a shouting match of who's the loudest that we can call out, it's not particularly fair. So if we can have folks come up. So come on up, guys.
Give her a quick answer.
Yeah.
Give her a quick answer.
Sure.
So Richard, Greg, Ursula? Yeah. Yeah.
We'll get that question asked.
Yeah. Come on up, guys. And Richard, there's going to be space for you here at the end. Yep. And Susan, let's have you gone up too. So guys, I'm going to have these 4 community members introduce themselves. And Dr. Buchanan, I'm going to have you introduce yourself and how your role is a little bit different than other folks here. So as I said, we got questions in a number of different ways. People submitted, we got lots and lots of questions online. People submitted them at the open house today, and there were some questions left over from last time. These guys have had to sort through and prioritize. It's really difficult, so I know they're trying to do their best. What I'd like to do is, Richard, why don't you first introduce yourself, have each of the new panelists introduce yourself and your role, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Good evening. My name is Richard Morton. I'm a community member.
No, I can't hear
Yep.
you.
Sorry about that.
New mic.
New mic. There's one over here. Yep.
Good evening. My name is Richard Morton. I live in Burr Ridge. I've been a resident of Burr Ridge since 1989. I became interested in Sterigenics and ethylene oxide August 21st. And I've been aligned with a group of about 20 professionals, researchers that have been studying this phenomenon, this health concern in Burr Ridge, and I've paid particular attention to the cancer risks as well as the concentrations in the test data.
Why don't you, Ursula, you want to introduce yourself? And then we'll... Hello? You got it? You're good?
Good. Hello. Hi, I'm Ursula Tanaway. I'm one of the founding members of Stop Sterigenics. We got together shortly after we found out in late August about the situation, and we have been working on this issue ever since.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Greg Hart. I'm a DuPage County board member representing District 3, which includes the communities affected by this: Willowbrook, Burr Ridge, Hinsdale, and all the surrounding communities within that radius in DuPage County. But mostly the reason why I'm here is because I'm someone who lives currently 4 miles from this facility. I'm someone who grew up 2 miles from this facility, so I know the fear that we've all been experiencing over the last couple months, and that's why I'm here to hopefully represent the questions that a lot of you have submitted. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Susan Buchanan. I'm from the University of Illinois at Chicago, over at UIC, and I'm a physician with board certification in occupational and environmental medicine, which is a small specialty field within preventive medicine. So I'm here to represent and answer questions about the cancer health effects of exposure to ethylene oxide.
Mark Johnson, Regional Director for ATSDR, training in toxicology and supporting Michelle's work in assessing the health impacts from exposure in this community.
Great, thank you guys. So what we're going to do is we're just going to rotate through. I really encourage you guys to try to be as concise with your answers as possible. I realize these are very technical issues, but there will be a webinar follow-up if there's need to be, but I know they want to get to as many questions as possible. So Richard, if you want to start, and we'll just rotate through.
Actually, I'd like to suggest Ursula starts because we prepared the questions in an order that makes sense.
Go that way.
They'll follow on one after another.
Yep, that's fine.
Hi, I'd like to start us off by just doing a quick review of all the different studies. I know we went through them pretty quickly and there are several of them. So I kind of wanted to break down and see what information we learn from each of the types of studies and how they compare just to set the stage. So first, can you describe the difference between cancer risk and cancer incidence?
Hi. Can anybody hear me? Oh, there I am. Great. So cancer risk is an estimate of somebody's chance of getting cancer, and that's designed to go into the future. Cancer incidence, and I should probably defer you on this, is, at least is what the Illinois Department of Health did, is counted actual cancer cases that have already happened. So they can be, they're separate concepts.
And what can each of those concepts tell us as a population?
I'll speak to the risk and then I'll hand it over to Kyle. So the risk assessment is an estimate of somebody's future chance of getting risk. A risk assessment is a tool that decision makers use to get an idea of what somebody's risk in the future might be, and that tells us if those risks need to be lowered or not. It's a decision tool.
So cancer incidence is the reality version of the risk. The risk is more theoretical. Cancer incidence is the reality. And it's very informative when it comes to understanding environmental risks. Do they actually have an impact on cancer incidence? Health behaviors, genetic markers and things like that. The actual cancer incidence, the actual count of cancer cases is very important in informing science around the reality of what goes into cancer etiology or the beginnings of cancer.
If I can add to that, so I think epidemiological assessments using cancer incidence is a rather insensitive measure of health impacts, and that's why the tool of using risk assessment allows us then to predict what might be the health effects of exposure below what we can actually measure. And so we use that as a basis in our assessments, and it's a way of verifying and making decisions, and not waiting for evidence of disease in the community before we take action.
And then as a part two, I know there are two different risk assessments being talked about, one by the ATSDR and one by the US EPA. Can you break down the differences between those two risk assessments for us?
Well, for us, we are looking at air measurements and calculating risk from air measurements. So those are observed data, ETO concentrations that have been measured in ambient air. And Kelly can tell you that hers is based on modeling.
So the assessment that we did is based, as Michelle said, on modeling. So we get information on what the facility is emitting, the pollution that it's putting into the air. We put that into what we call an air dispersion model, which simulates the movement of the pollution around the community and estimates an air concentration. And then we use that air concentration and associate that with how toxic it is for folks. And then we do the estimate on that, and that ends up with this theoretical risk assessment.
I just want to add, we actually are calculating that for each of the monitoring sites. So ours, we typically try to evaluate risk for the most exposed resident and the most exposed worker. So that's a little bit different because we're trying to be conservative, again, to be protective of public health. So we are looking at, in the first document you saw that we calculated the risk for the west. There was a monitor site in the west neighborhood at a residence. So that was our most exposed resident. So if anyone has high exposure, it's not acceptable. So that's kind of why we look at the most exposed worker, most exposed resident.
But the main point is that these are not competing assessments. These are complementary assessments using both measured concentrations as well as modeled data.
And then as a final follow-up, how can you compare all of these to what we saw in the NATA map?
The new assessment versus NATA. So NATA is a screening assessment, and so it's not as precise as the more refined assessment that we did. We used much better emissions data from the facility that we gathered ourselves and modeled at a more refined level. So we have, it's not better, it's just a different, more detailed assessment, this follow-up assessment than NATA is. NATA is a tool to tell us where to look further, do more work to see if there's really something there. So we did that follow-up assessment, and then you saw the results of that.
And Kelly, those who haven't been following closely, the NATA study was kind of what brought you initially to look at this site?
Right, so the NATA study is a national air toxics assessment that we do every few years, and it looks at many different types of sources of air pollution around the country. And there are certain areas of the country where that the risks appear that they may be high, we don't know, but it's an indication to do more work and look further. And this area is one of the areas that we had noticed in NATA, and that's one of the reasons we're doing more work here.
I almost want to add too, so NATA is an assessment of all sources of that cancer risk, and your risk assessment is specific to ethylene oxide.
Specific to ethylene oxides as emitted from the Sterigenics.
Thank you very much. We all saw a number of maps on our screen today, and I just want to make sure that we got a clear answer because I know it was a lot of information for myself and folks in the audience. As a clear answer, how far out, as far as number of miles away from the Sterigenics facility, do you have to get to being 1 out of 1 million in terms of your cancer risk?
For the current case, it's you go to 1 in a million at 6 miles out. And then it drops below 1 in a million about 20, 25 miles out.
Okay, but it's not 0 beyond 25 miles?
It's less than 1 beyond 25 miles.
Okay, and then how does that account for multiple facilities? We've all heard about the fact that Sterigenics is obviously operating in our backyard, but there's also facilities emitting ethylene oxide in Lake County, and assuming that that's less than 25 miles away from Sterigenics, for the people that live in that center area where those radiuses converge.
Right.
Is their risk any higher as a result?
If you're beyond 6, if you're between like 6 and 25 miles, you have a risk of 1 in a million from Sterigenics, which would be in addition to any other risks you would have from that area.
And do you know roughly how many people live within that affected area?
Not the whole domain. We can get that answer for you.
Okay. Thank you, that'd be helpful. We also know that this facility's been, just as a follow-up, been operating for some time. How does the risk assessment account for half-life ETO or ETO that may be lingering in the area?
So Well, I think you asked two questions. The facility's been in place for a long time. Now, the assessment that we did, again, it's an estimate of the future, so it doesn't and it can't look backwards. The risk assessments that we do look forward, not backwards. And we don't account for the half-life for any breakdown of ethylene oxide. It's fairly stable in the environment, so we assume that everybody's getting all of the ethylene oxide. If that makes any sense.
I think so. So I know it looks forward, but assuming that it's been operating for a number of years, what you're saying is that it doesn't consider the fact that there could be ETO that's been in the atmosphere even without Sterigenics operating. I guess that's my question. There's no fear that it wouldn't be an impact to the cancer incidents from previous emissions.
I'm sorry, can you try? I'm not sure I'm following your question.
Are you asking, if there's residual ETO that may be part of the background, would you look at the background?
Exact, yeah. Much easier said than I tried to explain it.
Say it out loud for people.
So the answer is, did we include other sources of ethylene oxide in the risk assessment? We only included the emissions from the Sterigenics facility itself. The idea was to say, how much cancer risk is caused by the emissions from that particular facility, and that is useful in making a decision about whether or not the risks need to be reduced from that facility. It's what can be controlled. So that's the question that particular risk assessment is designed to answer.
Thank you.
Okay, so one of the challenges we were faced with, there were 84 questions that we had to parse down into a period of time of 50 some odd minutes. So you may not hear a specific question that you asked. We tried to compress them to make them all get some airtime. To summarize very quickly, IDPH did go in and look at the groups of people that were statistically significant and elevated levels of cancer in the geographic area, so I won't ask that question. But a follow-up to that is that how far the risk extends from the facility if you chose a different population to calculate the state background level. In other words, I think I've confused that, so let me state it again. You use census tracts, especially in the census tract, southern census tract that extends about 9 miles from the source of Sterigenics. And you just mentioned that the ethylene oxide drops precipitously within a mile or less. So you have 8 miles of a census tract that would have decreased or impacted the ratio of expected versus observed cancers. So I wonder if we could gain a better understanding of the cancers that were related to Sterigenics, if you could reevaluate your cancer database on a linear model ranging in a series of distances radiating away from Sterigenics on each of the compass points, perhaps every quarter of a mile, identifying the cancers that occurred within that ring. Could you address that point?
That study design certainly is a possibility, but the study design that we had employed here was the type of study that we could quickly respond to the community's concerns regarding cancer elevations, possible cancer elevations in and around the Sterigenics facility. So that was the rationale for choosing the design that we did. Not to say that such a design that you describe is not possible, but that's certainly possible in future studies, which we encourage.
Right, well, I'm one of the lucky people that live in the mustard zone. I assume there's other mustard zone livers out here too that are the 2 to 500 risk. And that's the baseline risk, which in addition to that, we have to put the 0.15 microgram additional risk, which gets it into pretty heavy cancer risk range. So a follow-up question to that, you have a population either in study area 1 or study area 2, nominally 70,000 people. And US Census in 2016 says that about 11% of us move every year. So of that 70,000 people, nearly 8,000 people move away from the impact area of Sterigenics, and they will be undercounted when they get sick in Patterson, New Jersey, or Miami, Florida, And I'd like to know what steps IDPH could be taking to try to recapture those missing people.
You know, that is a serious limitation with our study, and certainly I think speaks to your question. You know, like I said before, the cancer registry, when it collects a cancer case, it's a snapshot at that point in time. It's their address at that point in time. We are well aware that someone may move into the area for 6 months and then get diagnosed with cancer, somewhat of an overcount, if you will, but you're absolutely true that people will live here for 20 years and move out of the area, get diagnosed with cancer elsewhere, and we would never know, so that's an undercount. You know, to address that, you know, we would need to really delve deeply into really essentially the history of the area, figure out who has lived there, and do long-term follow-up and track these people down. That type of study.
Yes, we need to we know the stories. We know the names of people that lived here and died. We know the kids that went to school here, moved away and died.
Guys, let's try to keep the focus here, but obviously the question is, are you guys going to do that?
Sure. I can't promise that type of study can be done because that is an extremely labor and resource intensive study.
So's cancer, living with cancer is dead lives labor intensive.
Guys, you've made your point clear to them, I think. Let's keep on with the questions.
Make Sterigenics pay for it.
I'm going to keep going with Kyle a little bit. The comparative populations that were used in that study, one of them is DuPage County, which was already noted to have an exceptionally high risk for breast cancer, or high incidence of breast cancer. And the other was the collar counties of Chicago, which included Lake. At the time that you started the study, were you aware that Lake also has ethylene oxide emissions similar to Sterigenics? And is there a plan to redo that study with perhaps a different baseline population to compare to?
So the comparison groups were chosen because we wanted demographically similar populations to compare our study area to. And I think we succeeded in doing that in comparing it to DuPage County as a whole, as well as the five collar counties. Yes, you're correct. There are other ETO emitters in different areas that were certainly a part of that comparison group. But when you talk about the size of the collar counties and the number and the population that is included there, it would kind of water down the effect of any ETO emissions in Lake County, for example. And as a comparison to a study area where it's tightly focused around a ETO emission area, I think that that particular scenario would be less of a concern because of the size of the population in the collar counties and those not exposed to ETO.
Can you tell me how many people, as an estimate, are included in those 5 collar counties?
I don't know the population of those collar counties off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I can get that for you.
And then maybe this is a better question for Kelly, about how many people are within that that range that goes from the top risk to 1 in a million around Sterigenics. And then is that population density similar in Lake County, and can we add those numbers to that as well?
Yeah, we can get you the population numbers, but I don't have those at the top of my head either.
Thank you. Is the risk assessments that have been shared with us tonight adjusted for age? And if not, would age impact anyone's likely or susceptibility to some of the negative byproducts of ETO?
So we looked at an exposure assuming that somebody was exposed from birth to the age of 70. So ethylene oxide is more potent for children, and that is included in the risk estimate. So it's a 0 to 70 exposure.
Okay. And just for those who may not have picked up on it, because I know I didn't, the significance of the number 70, when we say that as far as it being used in the risk assessment, it doesn't mean you have to be exposed for 70 years to have risk. Is that an accurate statement?
Correct. We look at a 70-year period of exposure, but somebody could get cancer with a shorter exposure.
Right. And then the significance of 70, do you mind just touching on that?
Well, that comes from what the Clean Air Act tells us to do in our particular regulatory program at the US EPA, and it says to protect the individual most exposed. So that to us means a very long time that somebody's exposed to that pollutant. And historically 70 years has been considered sort of a lifetime risk. Even though people live longer than 70 years, it's been our rule of thumb. And so it's part of our regulatory program.
Teenagers that are breathing in toxic ETO at our schools, parks, gyms, pools, and homes for most of our lives, they're curious what medical signs they should be looking for in the future to ensure that they're looking out for their long-term health. And I would amplify, there was a comment Greg made or asked about age-dependent adjustment factors. And I think it's important to note that up to age 2, the adjustment factor is a 10-time multiple. And from age up to 16, it's a 3-time multiplier. And over 6 times, it's a 1-time. So our children in schools are affected at a much greater rate than we are. And so what advice could you give teenagers in grade school or elementary school going into high school about their future health?
I'll take that question. I think it's an excellent question. I appreciate that teenagers are interested in their health. I would say a couple things. One, for their general health, to prevent cancer in general, I would encourage them never to start smoking. But the symptoms of these types of cancers, the lymphopoietic cancers, leukemia, lymphoma, the symptoms are typically very vague, and they can cause initially things like low energy or fatigue. And for many physicians, that might be a really vague symptom that doesn't prompt a workup. And one thing that we've talked about is having people encourage their physicians to recognize that they have a history of exposure to ethylene oxide and talk to their physicians about doing a blood count on an annual basis or when there are these vague symptoms. Maybe to have their physicians have a lower threshold for drawing a blood count when there are vague symptoms than they would otherwise in somebody who wasn't exposed.
Thank you. As a follow-on, that we have 2 competing agencies that are doing cancer risk modeling. We have ATSDR and we have EPA, and they're both using different age limits and lengths of exposure. EPA is 70 years. ATSDR for Willowbrook, I think, was 33 years on a 78-year life. When you look at it overall, they both end up with numbers that are more closely aligned than apart. And why do we have these 2 divergent metrics?
Well, for EPA, again, as I indicated, the Clean Air Act really directs us to use a lifetime exposure, and so we use 70 years. And I think...
Well, Mark works on the work group, so I'll let him talk about that as a toxicologist.
Right. So as Kelly said, the methodology that EPA uses as for regulatory purposes is prescribed in the Clean Air Act. For our assessment, we're looking at specific population dynamics and tailoring our assessment that meets the evaluation of the community we're evaluating. So we assume we have better understanding now with lifetime averages of 78 years in our assessment, and we use 33 years as the duration of residency time for a specific location. So we try to, again, tailor the assessment to that's specific for that community. That's why we're somewhat different in our assessments. We have more flexibility in making those changes than a regulatory program would have. That explains why there might be some differences in our assumptions.
Also, just to add to that, we also make an assumption. We use an upper confidence limit of the mean, so it's not just a modeled concentration, it's the upper bound estimate of exposure. So to be health protective again, we're looking at the reasonable maximum average concentration that a person might be exposed to over that period of time. So that's a little different as well.
But the other point is that we use the same toxicity value, the cancer potency value that EPA uses. And so that's the constant between our two assessments.
And I'd like to reiterate something that Mark said earlier, is that essentially these analyses that we do are complementary. They may have different time periods, but at the end of the day, the methodologies are quite similar.
Thank you.
I think I'd like to clarify a little bit more what levels the risk assessment evaluates. So we're talking about the levels of emissions that were after the back fence were added, but before the seal order, correct?
Correct.
And are these emissions higher or lower than exposures in previous time periods?
Based on the information that we've got, that they would be lower, certainly lower than before the back vent was connected, and likely lower than historical levels.
So how would we go about estimating our risks based on where we lived and the years we lived there? What goes into those calculations?
That's not a question that a risk assessment can answer. We don't have the data to do that.
Okay. What data would be needed to calculate those risks?
A lot more information about emissions, information on historical meteorology, I guess it's mostly about understanding the emissions going back. Again, our assessment starts based on the emissions that we've got now and looks forward into the future. And again, it's a decision tool to determine, to help inform a decision maker's decision about whether or not and by how much to reduce emissions at a particular facility. That's the purpose of that kind of risk assessment.
Is it fair to say that someone who lived in this area since Sterigenics opened in 1984 has a higher or lower risk of cancer than the numbers that were calculated from this short window of emissions time?
So risk assessment is a function of how much the emissions, how much somebody's breathing. If the emissions are higher, all things being equal with the town and the meteorology, the concentrations that they were breathing is higher. So if somebody was breathing more emissions before, then the risks would be higher. We don't know by how much, but it stands to reason that they would be higher.
Do you have a ballpark for how much given the historic emissions?
No, we do not.
And just following up on that last point, are the national emissions available somewhere publicly, and if so, where can we access that?
National emissions?
National emissions as well as historical emissions from this area.
The national emissions are available at EPA's National Emissions Inventory, and we can get you that information. And we do keep that for a period of time. Going back is probably TRI, right? The Toxics Release Inventory is probably better for historical information. It's not very detailed and not, frankly, terribly useful for a risk assessment, but you can give you an idea, maybe, of what the previous emissions were. Okay. But it's not fabulously accurate historically.
Okay. And then you mentioned there's some dependency on meteorology with all of this. How does ETO, I guess, first and foremost, how does it move through the air? And what would cause ETO, what weather conditions would cause ETO to linger in one area And is that present in Willowbrook and in Burridge?
It moves with the wind. It's a gas. And so it's emitted into the air, and it moves with the wind. If the terrain, it might move differently with the terrain, but it moves just as the air moves.
As far as precipitation, though, I mean, does that play a role?
Rain doesn't really wash it out very much.
How does the risk assessment handle the occurrence of multiple cancer incidents in an individual? And as a follow-on, we're aware of anecdotal stories of rare illnesses, bone tumors in children, atypical lymphomas, gastric or pancreatic cancers, endocrine disorders. How can the Illinois Department of Public Health, or ATSDR, CDC, collect the data on these rare diseases, and how can we initiate a request for such data to be compiled? Or did we just initiate the request? That's it?
So you guys have regulations on how to regulate this stuff, but you guys don't know what it really does. Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Tifu Shen, and I'm a Division Chief of Epidemiological Studies at the Illinois Department of Public Health. Answer to the question is that we have multiple channels to disseminate data and for public to get access to the data. One is to go to our webpage that we maintain a public use data that you could query different cancers in terms of numbers. We also maintain a downloadable micro data file. By that term, I mean that's a record level cancer data. So if you want to run regressions, if you want to tabulate the data, you could download that large file. A fair warning here is that the size is quite large. And then there's another channel that is through our institutional review board as a research request. So you submit that, and our IRB review that, and if you pledge to protect confidentiality, and you're going to put data into good use, then you get access to the data.
Thank you, but I think it's important that we generate a list of health conditions that's accessible to the community, that the professional caregivers in the community can be aware of. Somebody on this panel made the point about following children and the importance of ongoing CBCs to early detection of possible health consequences. And I think it would be a great public service if you could come up with all of the spectrum that we know about of related health conditions, perhaps non-cancerous, that we could all use as a community to better take care of our health.
On our website, we do have a sort of a data dictionary where you could see the name of a different database, and then within each database, the different data variables and their formatting values, things like that. We maintain that for quite a while, and we still have that on the webpage. So that will give an overview of what kind of health conditions that we have with IDPH. But here I have to say that we don't collect data on everything. There are some important disease, but for some reason, funding or no way to other, lack of mandate, we don't collect them. But for cancer, we collect very good data on the cancer. We collect very good data on the vital record and birth record, birth defect, and a number of other things.
Thank you.
Yeah, and to add to that point, though, I think the first part of your question that had to do with multiple cancers.
Yes.
So it's true, though, that if someone had multiple cancers, they would be treated as separate cases because they're separate incidences. So that would be recorded in the evaluation of the rate of occurrence of the cancer. And also at a national level, As Shen had mentioned, the data is collected at the state level. There's no federal surveillance for incidents other than what we collect and report it to CDC from state agencies.
Just to clarify, you said so they're treated separately?
That's correct.
Yeah, thank you.
I understand that the risk assessment follows separate calculations for residents and workers. Does it also account for the location of schools in calculating childhood exposure?
No, we sort of roll that into the 7-year exposure. We look at the lifetime exposure, again, assuming somebody's exposed from birth to age 70, breathing the pollutant the entire time. And that's a large exposure, and it's a health protective assumption. So if we're making decisions based on that level of risk, it's designed to be protective of the whole population. So it's a health protective assumption that we use.
We are the same. We assume that a child is born, raised, and goes to school in the area. So it's a continuous exposure over the entire period.
One question that was submitted was on behalf of a number of people who both live in this area but also either own businesses or operate schools. What preventative measures can these entities do to mitigate the potential risk of ETO inside of their buildings, whether it be from lingering emissions or new emissions that are taking place? Is there anything a homeowner can do to protect his or her home for their air quality inside?
Yeah, I mean, we can look into that.
Well, how about the EPA guy answer that?
Yeah, our focus has been outdoor air, but of course what's outdoor comes indoor. And I know we do have an office that deals with indoor air at EPA, and we've consulted with them about this very issue. And they've raised concerns about potential indoor sources of ethylene oxide, be it from cleaning supplies, smoking, whatever, or ventilation issues. So potential indoor sources or ventilation issues are something that would need to get looked at.
Who cleans your office?
I have a quick question. It's been one that's been rather dated, and I believe it's been answered, but just to make sure it's been answered. A number of months ago, there was a possible reported contamination of concentrations of ETO with trans-2-butene. And I think it's been dismissed as being a non-problem, but could you speak to that issue to make sure that we don't have anyone still operating under the idea that the samples were contaminated beyond use?
So when we started monitoring in this community, that we did not have a lot of experience looking at this chemical, and we've certainly learned a lot through our 4.5 months worth of monitoring. Early on, we did identify a potential interferent, this trans-2-butene. We actually did see it in very small amounts in a few, stress very few of the samples. For the most part, it was not necessarily something that was prevalent in the air in this community. Most of what we did measure, we were able to successfully analyze as ethylene oxide. But we did learn a lot through the campaign, this monitoring campaign here.
Thank you. How are we doing on time?
About 10 more minutes.
Give me 1 minute to just make another pass through the list to see.
You have 20.
I have 20 minutes? Okay.
So I know we have another panel coming up. I don't know if we'll spend the whole remainder of the 20 minutes talking about the study.
You don't have to feel compelled.
No, I don't want to leave with a good question unanswered.
One question I have, and you may have already covered it, but to that point, if we don't get to everyone's questions that have been submitted to this point, how do people ask questions of the group sitting up here today moving forward? What's the best way to get information and get answers?
We've got an ETO email address that I think has been displayed around. Can somebody remind me what it is?
So if you email eto@epa.gov, you can get questions to us. If people have seen me around, I'm Laura McKelvey. You can also email me at mckelvey.laura@epa.gov. But it's better to go to the ETO box because we got more people looking at that.
And there's a link on the EPA website to HSDR. We also have a fact sheet on the table in the back where you can reach Michelle and I at any time, by email or by phone.
And for questions, health questions, we have a hotline and an email address also on our postcard at the table.
I don't see anything that jumps out at me as needing an additional question at this time, so I'm done.
Can the audience use that 20 minutes to ask questions?
Yeah, let's do this. Let's give like 10 minutes to the audience to ask some questions. People are really succinct. We're gonna do some creative microphone system here. We have an extra one that we can. And Ursula, you had another question first, and then we're gonna get to folks. But again, we're gonna have to be really succinct.
I did have one more from the audience. Of the 8,500 people in Willowbrook, according to these risk estimates, how many are expected to get cancer in their lifetime if these emissions are as that time period, those emissions levels that you studied in this risk assessment?
We didn't do that particular calculation for that population. We do a generalized risk assessment of X in a million risk, so we don't have that figure.
Sorry, I have one more question, then we'll get to audience. I apologize. As far as next steps, we may get into this in the next panel, but are there any plans right now for future monitoring and reassessment of the risk assessments moving forward based on new data?
Right now, it's too soon to say. When we paused monitoring at the end of March, we said we would revisit the monitoring question if and when conditions change in the community. So right now, as I said earlier, our commitment is to work with the state of Illinois to establish a protective control strategy prior to any reopening of the facility. So part of those conversations in terms of a protective control strategy would include looking at the monitoring questions. So that's something we will look at in conjunction with the state of Illinois.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll get to as many as we can in the next 15 minutes.
Thank you for taking my question. I actually have a PhD in biochemistry and molecular genetics and work at UIC in a cancer biology lab over the last 12 years. And I became interested in this topic because my children go to school in Willowbrook, and obviously it's a concern to me. And my question is, I have two questions. The first one is in your graphs of your kind of the statistics there of when you measured the decrease in the ethylene oxide levels in the ambient air. Is that, I guess, there was no significance, but I'm assuming that it was highly significant. I'm just concerned why there was no significance. Was there actually statistics included?
Do you mean the pre and post?
That's my first question. My second question is that they've actually done several studies up for a long time on ethylene oxide to know what DNA lesions are caused by the mutagen. That actually can be tested in individuals acutely that have been exposed in the recent 6-month period. Are you aware of this test, and have those were conducted in individuals? Is that the correct assumption that I'm making? Because I saw those on your, I believe I saw some of that, but there wasn't really any real graphs, so I'm just a little skeptical by your message here, because on one hand you say that there's these increases in cancer, but you're not saying specifically that it's significant. And that's really important when you're talking about exposure levels that are developing. Thank you.
Are you talking about the slide that I showed of the concentrations?
We had some graphs
The pre and post, we have statistics that are in the document, but it's, it would take much longer than 15 minutes to talk about, but they are in the document. Well, I was trying to describe the trends, which are that the closer you are to the site, the higher the concentrations. Okay, I appreciate that. But I think you were talking about the time series trends. I don't know if you can find those. Maybe go to the next one. Is this what you're talking about? Is that one of them?
No.
It's a table.
What is your chromatography method? Is this gas or gas chromatography for nitrogen?
This is a Summa canister, which is what was collected by EPA.
Is that the standard?
At TO15 is the standard, yes.
And there was the red letter, those red numbers?
I think it's the operating, the post and pre-operational.
Yeah. Guys, I would suggest this is a level of detail that's probably not effective for the entire audience. I know this might be the kind of question you address on a webinar or after the document comes out.
We could talk with you afterwards, so if you could.
We've got a woman over here. Yeah. Guys, we've got to share the time. There's a woman over here.
Yeah, we have a question here,
Yeah,
and just
and then
remember
this
their
gentleman's next.
analysis is not completed yet, so I think you can get some of your answers once they have their report done. That person was next, and then it's up to you.
In the modeling that you're doing at OAQPS, that depends upon emission rates or projected emission rates from Sterigenics. When Sterigenics did its emissions testing, they only tested emissions from one chamber out of 14 in plant 1 and one chamber out of 4 in plant 2. Also, during the ambient air monitoring, they have not released any of their production rates. So you don't know what their actual emissions are based on full production.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ned Shapley with OEQPS. Thanks for your question. You are correct. The testing in July was a very, very minimal scope. It didn't really incorporate the entire operation. One thing that's a little bit different from what we did from the time after July, when we started doing measurements until the seal order, is that we basically took the ambient measurements that we measured surrounding the facility, and then were able to kind of justify the emission estimates that were sent to us. And where our model took those estimates and it didn't match, we started adjusting the emissions higher until we were able to mimic what we saw in the ambient compared to what the emissions would be from the facility using modeling.
But you don't know what the full production rate was for these adjusted emissions.
Actually, we were given that information.
Guys, I'm going to keep moving on. There's a question over here. Yeah.
I can answer some of your questions, some of the gentleman's questions. I've gone through all the FOIA documents going back to 1984, and I know from the records, documents that came from Sterigenics, how much they told the Illinois EPA they were emitting every year. And in a couple of the years, it was over 200,000 pounds in a year on their letterhead that they're admitting that they released. And this went over for decades. Now, your modeling is looking at their current, or that time frame after they put on the back vents. So we're looking at maybe 2,000 pounds a year. And your numbers are coming off of that. When we know, going back to 1984, it was over 200,000 pounds a year. And then it kept going. Now, you also talk about 1995. In 1995, it was around the 20,000 pounds. Now, we know before that, it was up in 70 and 80. We've got all those documents. So I know you guys are talking about going forward. We only look going forward based on those numbers. But we know the real numbers. We know that ETO affects your DNA, Whether it's going to turn into cancer in a year, or 6 years, or 10 years, it's in your DNA. And so we know how much they've been doing over these 34 years, and those numbers are mind-boggling. When you talk about your assessment based on 2,000 pounds a year, what would your assessment look like, your risk assessment, if you were to base it off of 200,000 pounds a year? Somebody answer that question.
Well, it would be higher. Of course, it would be higher.
Tell us in your numbers.
Well, we would do the analysis.
Well, will you? Will you make a
We don't have enough information to do a risk assessment going backwards.
The air is going to be the same. The air has not changed the movement. Why can't you guys just answer this, that it's astronomical, that the names of the people we know are real? Because you guys keep talking about these small numbers. It's real.
I appreciate that.
Her cancer, it's real.
So, guys, we hear you. We know this, and we acknowledge that the risk is very, very high that you have been experiencing. And so, what we need to be able to do is what Kelly has done, and she's looked at the risk so that we know we have to regulate.
Patronize her.
Let's, what we're trying to do right now is get to as many questions as we can. We feel your emotion. We know you're upset. We want to. We've got a number of people with microphones we want to get to. So this young lady here.
Yep. So guys, keep it short so other people can share the time, please.
Hello, I'm Alexandra Collins. I was a student, a freshman at Hinsdale Central High School, and I had the question that how are you planning on monitoring the risk that students have that live outside of the 6 mile radius but attend school every single day or 5 days a week for 7 hours and are exposed to ethylene oxide in the areas that are heavier and at higher risk?
So the risk assessment is based on assuming that somebody is exposed from the age 0 to 70. So it's a very large dose that we're looking at in terms of determining what that risk is. So it's including your exposures. The assessment includes.
If you live outside of the 6 mile radius, further away, but you attend a school that's closer, so you're at higher risk when you attend the school, how do you plan on helping report that to people that attend school or teachers that work at school for, let's say, 20 years, but live in neighborhoods further away that are not part of this assessment?
Right, so if I'm understanding you, you're asking for somebody who might have less than the maximum risk, how are we protecting that person? We focus on the highest risk in the population and make decisions based on that.
We've got a question over here.
So guys, we have time for about 4 more questions.
Yes, hi. My name is Thea Tanaka. I'm a resident of Lake County. I'm here to represent Stop ETO in Lake County. My question is a yes or no question, and it's addressed to Bill Wirham and the Illinois EPA and Region 5 more specifically, and IDPH too, please. So yes or no question. Do you plan to come to Lake County and do a town hall forum and or for IDPH a cancer study within the next 3 months? Yes or no, please?
No. And
why?
What about McCook? We're getting it from all directions.
Yeah, you don't care.
I didn't care, I wouldn't be here.
Yeah, right.
No, but the reason is the situation is very different in Lake County. Medline has stepped up. Medline has been in constructive conversations with the state of Illinois about devising and installing and implementing and operating additional emissions controls to reduce the risk associated with that facility. That's a very different situation than we're facing right here. And we see what's happening there as very productive, and they're taking concrete steps to address the emissions from that facility. I can't speak, there's at least one other significant ethylene oxide emission source, a chemical manufacturing facility in Lake County, and I can't speak to the state of the conversations with the state of Illinois, but I know that there have been some conversations, and my impression is, and I would defer to my Illinois EPA colleagues if they have more to add on that. So from our perspective, things are very different in Lake County, and in a lot of ways they're very far ahead of what's happening here, and we think that represents progress, and we're deferring to our colleagues in the state of Illinois to continue that progress and try to get to across the finish line there.
In the next panel, we'll talk about next steps in Illinois, so we'll have time to focus on
I do want to say, though, that the Lake County Health Department has petitioned ATSDR to assist in the evaluation of the data that's being collected by the air monitoring around Medline and Vantage. And we will be communicating the findings of that assessment publicly, yes.
Well, we only have a few minutes left in this session, so let's get at least 2 more questions.
This might have been partially answered. This is for the gentleman from the IDPH. It appears that the study may have made a limitation in that pre-2000 data was used when the emissions was hundreds of thousands of pounds. How was that going to impact your control groups?
I was having a hard time hearing you. Could you repeat that?
Your study was in a period where the emissions were hundreds of thousands of pounds of EO, as maybe 5,000 as recently reported. Your control groups of DuPage and your other Colorado counties could have been impacted by those emissions prior to 2000. How are you controlling for that?
Well, that's obviously one of the limitations of the study, that we don't have detailed data on risk factors such as the amount of ethylene oxide that people could have been exposed to. It's a comparison group. This isn't a case control study. This isn't. Sure. We're talking about the comparison of populations, and it's impossible to find a population that is not impacted by cancer. That's impossible. So, sure. That certainly is a possibility, and it's an issue, but it's inherent in epidemiology, and we can't.
So I think what we've heard is there's different concerns in the audience about the controls you used, and we're going to have to take those at maybe a webinar at a later time, but there's lots of concerns about the control issue and what populations you looked at. I have one more question here.
Thank you. This question goes to the EPA refined risk assessment study. Valuable US EPA resources spent on a speculative, illustrative future case. What are you doing the groundwork for?
So we were wanting to see if the emissions, if lowered, if that would lower the risk. So it's a what-if scenario. We didn't know how it would turn out. We used what we know about the Willowbrook facility, and again used what some of the basic parameters that the Medline facility is going to have to do now. It's at higher stacks, negative pressure, and just asked ourselves the question, if the more controls were put on that facility, would the risk be lowered? And then we just showed the results.
Okay. This is our last question for this panel, and then we'll switch over. There will be another stakeholder panel for the next.
Actually, I have
step.
a question for you. I've pulled up your schedule, and I've seen an awful lot of meetings with Sterigenics. Why? And you told us in a webinar that we should trust Sterigenics. They're a bad neighbor. They're bad actors. So you looked me in the eye when you were here last and said that you were going to help us with this. How is your meeting with Sterigenics and not meeting with the community members or hearing from us outside of this helping us? What are you doing to protect us?
So I meet regularly with Sterigenics at my level and also
Yeah, I do as well.
at the
I
staff
do as
level.
well. I meet with them regularly too.
Why are you giving them more latitude than you're giving the people who have had cancer or who have died? You shouldn't be communicating with them. You should
Right.
do answer to us.
But communications doesn't
Hey,
mean...
look, can we give them a chance to answer, guys?
Right. So we're regulators, and from our perspective, it's always better to regulate with cooperation of the people we regulate, not in contention with the people we regulate. We can fight them, but it's a lot easier to do this in a way that's collaborative rather than adversarial. And so, you know, every time that we do regulation, every time that we do permits, we open a dialogue with all interested parties, and that always includes the person we're regulating, but it also includes others with an interest, including people in this room. And again, that's why we are here today, and our interaction has not been limited just to the couple meetings that we've had here. There is a lot of dialogue between myself and, you know, members of my staff at EPA with a lot of people in the community. So it's important to us to have those lines of communication. It's important to maintain those lines of communication. We try very hard to do that. We talk with our co-regulators at the state of Illinois. We talk with our public health agencies like the Illinois Department of Public Health and ATSDR. So it's important that we have a lot of perspectives and a lot of viewpoints, that the more information we have, the better the job that we can do, and that includes communications with Sterigenics, and you bet we do communicate with Sterigenics.
Why aren't they shared more information with Sterigenics about the reports than you guys have shared with us tonight?
I don't believe so. I certainly have
Did they
not.
have the
Do you know?
information before we did tonight?
No.
Why aren't they here? As the planning group, you know, as Doug and Christy mentioned, we've had a big planning group. The planning group asked us to invite them, and we did invite them, and they decided that at this point they didn't want to participate, but they did think about it quite a bit and contemplated it, and they decided not to.
So guys, there's clearly a huge amount of interest in terms of what's going to happen next. I hear lots of terms of keep it shut and other things. We're now going to switch. These were very detailed studies. We're going to switch to the issue of, so what's happening next? And so we're going to ask these folks to come off stage. We're going to bring on new folks, and we're going to switch to that exact issue.
Bill and John Kemp to come on up.
So guys, if you want to.
And thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Guys, not an easy job for them on stage, not an easy job to be in this community. We realize it's a very difficult situation for everybody. We appreciate your patience.
So we have this is our last panel for the evening. We're talking about where we're going from here. Bill does have a few slides. You can move forward on that. And then we'll have another stakeholder panel come on up and ask questions.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about what happens next.
Can you just talk, instead of you're prepared, can you just talk to us?
We will do both. I will be quick. I think you already know most of what I have to say, and I suspect you know what most of Director Kim has to say. But as we've been telling you from the beginning, this is a process, and step one in the process is to learn as much as we can about the situation and use our analytical tools to to do the things like the risk assessment that have been described tonight. So we are nearing the end of the information gathering and analytical phase, and we're moving into the what do we do about it phase. And we said from the beginning, you know, we're not going to go half-cocked. If we're going to take steps to try to solve the problem, we have to fully understand the problem so that we can be confident that the steps we take are going to be an effective remedy to the problem that we see. We've said from the beginning that, at least from a national standpoint, so from my perspective running air programs at EPA, normally what we would do when we see a situation like this is we would regulate. That's what we do. We establish national regulations, and we, in fact, as you know, I'll talk a little bit more about this, have regulations in place for commercial ethylene oxide sterilizers. You know, based on current science, they're out of date, so we're working on updating them. For most of the country, that regulatory process will be effective, because for most of the country, they don't see the risk levels that you see here in this community and in certain other communities that have similar facilities. So for a lot of the country, the normal regulatory process is going to be effective, and the normal regulatory process takes time. We've talked about this before. To do rulemaking of the sort that we do takes months as the best case. Sometimes take years. And we concluded very early on that we didn't want to wait months or years to figure out if something could be done in Willowbrook and other similar communities around the country. So prong two, I'm sorry, I've accidentally advanced here. Prong two of our effort was not to wait around months or years, but to, in communities with particularly high levels of risk, including Willowbrook, we would do site-specific assessment, which we're nearing the end of, and then we would work with our co-regulators at the state level to develop site-specific remedies. And that's part of the process we're launching right now. And in fact, not just in conjunction with the state of Illinois, but in fact the state of Illinois is on point for developing the remedy, because Mike Kerber described this earlier. Under the Clean Air Act, there's a division of responsibility between the federal government and the states. We regulate broadly, they regulate specifically. So this is a very specific situation dealing with a very particular, one and only one particular facility. And the state of Illinois is in a much better position than we are, has better tools to deal with that situation. And John will talk a little bit about that here in a second. So that's been our strategy from the beginning. You've probably heard me say that before, but we have a plan and we're sticking with it.
You talk too much.
Yeah, the comment was I talk too much, and it's not the first time I've been accused of that. So I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing on the national regulatory front, and I will be brief. And then I'm going to hand it over to Director Kent to talk about, to the degree he can, about what's going on with the facility itself. We've had rules in place for commercial sterilizers for a long time. We put the first one in place in 1994. It's been revised a couple times. In 2001, it was actually revised to reduce the level of control because, as was observed earlier in the meeting, a couple facilities experienced explosions based on the type of air pollution controls they were using, and the rules were changed to try to avoid that kind of incident. And then in April of 2006, we actually did a risk-based assessment of those standards to make a judgment as to whether they were adequately protective of public health. And at the time, we said yes. That was before 2016. There's a bullet missing on this slide, and we all know what happened in 2016, which is scientists at EPA and our Office of Research and Development did a reassessment of the health risks associated with exposure to ethylene oxide and concluded that ethylene oxide is a lot more potent than we ever thought it was before. So as a result of that, we did the NADA analysis that Kelly and others talked about earlier, a screening assessment, a rough cut, but it was intended to tell us whether there are areas of the country we need to focus on to possibly get additional emissions reductions to reduce risk. And at that point in time, we began looking once again, so for the fourth time, at the adequacy of the regulations we have in place. And as you might imagine, we've concluded the regulations are not adequate because they were based on the prior health potency value, the one that was in place before 2016. So changes need to be made. when we regulate, as I said, this is a months-long, if not a years-long process. And that's because we have to do it in a very deliberate way, in a very precise legal way that Congress requires. And it's a three-step process. We put together a proposed rule where we tell the world what we think we need to do, publish it in the Federal Register. Step 2 is that opens a public comment period where anybody with an interest in the rule has an opportunity to send us their comments and tell us if they think we got it right or not. And all of those comments go into a record and become a part of the record for the final rulemaking. Step 3 is to issue a final regulation where we take into consideration the public comments and other information analysis that we've developed in the meantime, and then put regulations in place that actually impose additional legal obligation, in this case on people who run commercial sterilizers. We are in the process of putting the proposed rule together. I skipped over on a prior slide our timing, as we very much hope to propose that rule within the next few weeks. We've been saying summer of 2019, but I think we may be able to pull it off in the month of June, and if not, it'll happen in the month of July. So that's when the proposed rule will come out. I know you all have an interest in that, and if you are interested enough, you can participate in the rulemaking. And this website, these slides will be made available to you. If they're not already posted on our website, they will be posted on the website. And these are links where you can gather more information about how to effectively participate in the rulemaking process that we intend to undertake. So, in a nutshell, that's what we're doing on a national regulatory front. And I'm going to hand it to Director Kim to talk a little bit about what's happening here at the state level and the facility level.
Thank you. So as I indicated at the beginning of the night, a lot of what I would love to be able to talk about, I can't because it is still under litigation. And so I cannot tell you right now exactly where that's going to go or exactly how that's going to go. You know, that will develop, and again, we are partnering with the Attorney General's office, the State's Attorney's office, and trying to bring that to some kind of conclusion as quickly as possible. What I can talk about, I guess, is to tell you a couple different things. First of all, as Bill noted, we are aware that US EPA is in process and anticipates going forward with a new proposal, which I presume would be something that would build upon the existing requirements that are found in the national standards for ethylene oxide. Our agency would track those, any proposals that they make, and would participate and provide comments as necessary. So certainly that's something that we'll follow up on. The more immediate thing might be something that Mayor Trill had mentioned before, which is this is the last week of the Illinois General Assembly before they adjourn for the spring session, assuming they don't go into overtime. And there's at least one piece of legislation that is working its way through. It's made its way through the House. It needs to get through the Senate, and assuming it does that with no changes, it would then go to the governor's office for review and action. That is something that is in the public record, it's in the public domain, and there is information in that legislation, again, that our agency and a lot of other stakeholders have worked on, that may give you some sense of how regulation will look, certainly at least from a legal standpoint. So, because I can't get into the litigation, I was just going to walk through the high points of the legislation. Some of you may be tracking this very carefully, may know this, and I'm not going to get into, I can get into more detail if I get more specific questions, but let me just give you sort of the main points. So what this is going to do is create a new section in the Environmental Protection Act. And that's, the Environmental Protection Act is the legislation, it's the statute that gives our agency the authority to act. It gives our agency the authority to conduct investigations and enforcement. It gives the Attorney General's office and state's attorney's offices the authority to go and conduct prosecutions and litigation. So this new section is going to require a number of different things. First thing it's going to require is you will not be able to operate, and I should have said, this legislation focuses on commercial sterilizing operations. And in the state of Illinois, we have two such operations. We have Medline located in Lake County, and we have Sterigenics located here in DuPage County.
So the first requirement for sterilization sources is they will not be able to operate unless they've demonstrated that they have obtained 100% capture and control, and that they have obtained at least 99.9% control efficiency or 0.2 ppm emissions from their exhaust points. And so a little bit about that, and that was touched on before. So capture and control is a concept that's already in place for different sources in the state of Illinois. It's not been applied to this type of source before, but it is a technology and it is a practice that we do already utilize for other sources, so it's not as if it's something that is novel or untested. And what it basically requires is you create a pressure imbalance. And so what you're doing is you're creating a vacuum so that you will maintain an inward draw on your exhaust, on your venting. You know, when you think of fugitive emissions, you know, I always think of, you have an old house and it's drafty and it's got creaks or cracks on the walls and this and that, and it's next to impossible to exactly track down exactly where all those escape points are. So if you create this negative pressure, this capture and control, what you're basically doing is you're creating an inward draw so those emissions never make it out the house. It's basically an internal vacuum, and they draw it in and it routes to a separate control source. Another requirement is that there will have to be an initial emissions test. And an emissions test is a test at the source as opposed to ambient air monitoring, which of course is testing in surrounding areas. So there will have to be an initial emissions test. And for all of these requirements that I'm going to describe, plans must be submitted to describe how they're going to implement this. They have to be reviewed and approved, and there's follow-up. I'm just sort of giving you the descriptions, but there are also these underlying requirements as well. So there has to be an initial test. There also has to be annual testing at least once every calendar year, at least 6 months apart in every calendar year. So initial upfront, and then from that point on, at least once every calendar year. There has to be continuous collection of emissions information. So that's just generating information that that we would maintain. It's basically continuous emissions monitoring and checking on a regular basis outside of the stack testing, outside of that emission testing, collecting information that gives, it's an additional layer of information. It's an additional layer of review and control that a regulator can have. There has to be a plan for ambient air monitoring, and this is now where you're going out into the community, into identified anticipated high density areas or high, what's the word I'm looking for? Areas where you would anticipate higher concentrations of emissions. And as part of that, there has to be dispersion modeling. And dispersion modeling is the exercise that you would do to determine those areas of expected high density emissions. Furthermore, in this legislation, there is a specific provision that says that if a facility has previously been subjected to a seal order, and one of the two sources in the state has been subjected to a seal order, then there is an additional layer of requirements. There has to be a certification from the suppliers of the medical equipment that are being sent to that sterilizer that ethylene oxide is the only available means to conduct sterilization. And there has to be a certification from the Illinois EPA that the technology that's being utilized at a source is providing the greatest reduction of emissions that is currently available. There is another requirement that says that if a facility obtains an intellectual property right that does not involve ethylene oxide, then the Illinois EPA has to be notified along with patent information. And the point behind that is, if they have received this intellectual property that says you can conduct sterilization of product X with something other than ethylene oxide, that information has to be sent to us so that we can take a look at that and we can pursue whether or not then that needs to be done there or it's appropriate for that to be done somewhere else. If there is a new facility that is submitting an application for what we call a Clean Air Act permit program, or a CAP permit, new permit applicants have to comply with certain setback requirements. Physical setback requirements, distance location between the facility and schools and parks. And those distances are based upon the size of the county that you live in. There has to be, that's just how it's drafted. There has to be notification of any deviations of the requirements that I'm describing, and they're set out again in much more detail in the legislation. Any deviation from those requirements has to be reported to the Illinois EPA, and then we will in turn post that information, the notice of that deviation, to our website, and we will also notify the relevant members of the General Assembly and the county. We are required to conduct, we, the Illinois EPA, will be required to conduct at least one unannounced inspection per year, which is pretty much what we do right now anyway. And finally, there's a requirement that the Illinois EPA will conduct air testing to determine a statewide ethylene oxide background level. And we will also be required to submit rules, proposed rules, to the Illinois Pollution Control Board, which is the state agency that takes in proposals and then promulgates rules. We will be required to submit rules to them that will address ambient air testing in a broader way that goes beyond the legislation, or to help effectuate what the legislation calls for. So that is the language in the bill right now. My guess is it's probably not going to change when it gets to the Senate. I can't guarantee that though, because it's obviously been a very complex piece of legislation that has been going back and forth and has been worked on for a very long time. And I can speak firsthand that all the legislators in this area, we've interacted directly with all of them, and they've all been very dedicated and very tireless in trying to come up with the most stringent fixes possible for their constituents, and they really should be commended for what they've been doing. But so that's working its way through. I would anticipate that something's going to happen with that soon. Basically, it has to happen before the end of the week, because that is the end of the session, and all bills have to be wrapped up and approved by the General Assembly by then.
So I'm going to invite our panelists up for this last panel, and if there's time left over, we'll go back to the audience as well. Same thing, if you quickly introduce yourselves, and then you can, I'm sure you have an order already planned for your questions.
Hello? Wake up. Thank you, everyone, for staying so late. What I will say is I think a lot of us have had sleepless nights over this issue. I know I have. My name is Julie Renahan. I'm a DuPage County board member like Greg Hart, also representing this area. Everywhere on the map is an area that I represent, so I'm very concerned. I've lived in Hinsdale the past 20 years, and what makes this even more difficult situation for me is my husband's family business has been located right across the street from Sterigenics for the past 30 plus years. So concerned about my family, I'm also concerned about his employees. I'm concerned about the economic health of Willowbrook, concerned about property values, a litany of issues that I think we're all concerned about. I just want to thank everyone for being here, see what the next steps are.
Good evening, my name is Sri Rao. I'm one of the founders of the Stop Sterigenics group. I live in Willowbrook, approximately 150 feet from the Gower West testing site. So I have a very good idea of exactly how much ethylene oxide was in the air surrounding us. I also have a 4-year-old daughter who fits right in the pediatric female highest cancer incidence rate. So I'm extremely concerned about this situation.
You guys already know me. You guys know me too, and I just want to say that we're here because the complacency of, I think, most of the population has led us to here. And this is where we need our voices to raise up. We need to keep on pushing so that the lobbyists are not allowed to turn the head of the EPA to their favor. We need to turn the EPA back to protecting the environment and the people.
So we've heard the AT-SDR levels when Sterigenics was operating. We heard the dramatic reduction when they were closed. We've heard the EPA is setting levels based on air toxins, and that is, sounds like to me, the amount of poundage that is allowed to go through. And I'm concerned about how these risk levels are determined, but our task on this panel is going forward. So my question is, what is the relative responsibility of the EPA and the Illinois EPA to residents, given they are setting the acceptable risk? I would like to know how you would manage that and how specifically you are monitoring the EPA and the Illinois EPA, not just Sterigenics.
Maybe I'll start and John can follow up. We have a little bit of a different set of responsibilities as I described and a little bit of a different approach here. When we do the national regulations, we will be looking at risk, and Congress has, and Kelly talked a little bit about this in her presentation, has told us quite specifically about how we're supposed to do these risk assessments and use that information in regulatory decision making. And you've heard me say this before if you were at the last meeting. Our goal at EPA is not to eliminate risk. That's generally not possible, and if we tried to eliminate risk, then we'd shut down most of the economy of the United States, because virtually all economic activity generates some level of risk to somebody. So our job is to regulate emissions to a degree that we reach what would be considered generally acceptable levels of risk. So that's why we use metrics like, 100 in a million and 10 in a million and 1 in a million. That's the yardstick we use to decide what kind of risk is presented by facilities like Sterigenics and Willowbrook. And those are the numbers that we use to make the regulatory decisions to decide what sorts of emissions limitations should be put in place to make sure we end up with an acceptable amount of risk to the population at large, including communities around these facilities. So again, Congress has been very specific. We regulate all different kinds of industries. We have 150 different standards like the one we've talked about for commercial sterilizers that apply to everything from iron and steel mills to paper mills to bread makers. We regulate bakeries because they all emit stuff, they all create risk to surrounding people and communities, and every one of them demands a different kind of solution to get to a point that we consider acceptable. So that's what we see as a mission here.
And if I don't answer your question, if I didn't get it, just please correct me. But I think what you were, I'll say this, from the Illinois EPA's perspective, as Bill noted, generally speaking, in this particular situation, we're talking about ethylene oxide, which is regulated as a hazardous air pollutant, and there's a national standard for that. And that's with good reason, because US EPA has the resources and the national reach to go through the kind of exercise they're doing right now. At the state level, our responsibility is to take those regulations and make sure that we're enforcing them and implementing them as rigorously as we can. And so we do that in a number of different ways. The most direct way we do that is through permit transactions. And so we will take federal or state regulatory requirements, we'll work those into a permit. We'll have long conversations with the facility to make sure that a permit is tailored to their types of operations. And then after that transaction happens, we enforce that. We maintain compliance. If we find instances of non-compliance, then that's when we would take action as authorized under our statute. We have certain limited ability to do that on our own. We have more formal enforcement authority when we work with our partners at the Attorney General's office. And so from the state's perspective, that is the way that we implement and try and ensure that the regulatory framework that we have in the state is as protective and as complete as possible. I hope that answered your question.
Sort of. I heard Mr. Korber say something about local control is so important. can we expect that the Illinois EPA regulations would go further than the EPA?
Well, I'll say this. I don't know what US EPA what they're looking at right now in terms of their proposed, any proposals that they might come up with later on this year. But the legislation that I just read, which is all applicable at the state, and we would be enforcing that, that's not found in at the federal level. That's not found, from what we can tell, for pretty much this particular suite in any other state. So I do think it's not exaggeration to say that this particular combination of requirements really goes far beyond anything that you can find nationwide. And so in that sense, yes, it does go. State regulation and federal regulation is set up so that states have to be at least as stringent as federal requirements. We can be more stringent, we can't be less stringent, and we can't conflict, because if you conflict, then there's a question of who is in control, and the federal government is, and that's a preemption issue. But what this legislation represents is more stringent regulation that is not inconsistent with anything that is found at the federal level.
Okay, I appreciate that, because we need more stringent regulation because we have some of the worst numbers in the country. Kind of moving on, the legislation that you spoke of, it said 99.5%, 99.9%. Does that mean, can you tell us anything in terms of poundage, in terms of emissions? What can we expect?
So 99.9 is control efficiency, and that's working off of, that is slightly more stringent than the federal number, but control efficiency does not measure poundage. Control efficiency basically says, if you have an exhaust point, then whatever amount is going through your exhaust point, whatever amount of, in this case, ethylene oxide is going through, you have to control that through whatever system of control technologies you have to at least the specified number. And the legislation will call for 99.9%. So that doesn't necessarily go towards poundage. That doesn't mean that the state can't do what you're talking about. And just as example, and again, these permits are tailored for facility, but if you look at the Medline permit that was previously discussed, the draft permit, it does have the type of number that you're talking about.
Let's talk a little bit about, we heard what was to me a new terminology of a highly controlled facility. And I'd just like to know, what exactly does this mean, a highly controlled facility?
Well, I'll start. That's not a regulatory term of art, that's a general description. So I'm not sure I use that term, I'm not sure my folks use that term, but in any event, I would construe that to mean something that has, very up-to-date state-of-the-art air pollution controls. That tends to be what our regulation, or what the law requires us to impose through regulation.
Okay, I think we had heard that a highly controlled facility could cause risks to be low, and I think it was discussed yesterday in our discussion with reference to what kind of control would be okay.
And I guess what I would observe, and again, that's not a regulatory term of art, so I think that's just a general description, but what I would observe is the Sterigenics facility already has a suite of air pollution controls on it, and we know that there are additional measures that can be implemented, and Director Kim has described some of the measures that are being considered in the legislation, and they go a good bit beyond what is already being implemented in the Sterigenics facility. So I think if you're thinking about a highly controlled facility or a higher degree of control, that's exactly what we're thinking about from a national regulatory standpoint, and Illinois EPA is thinking about with respect to these particular facilities. What are the possibilities for achieving additional emissions reductions? Can it be implemented? Yeah, sorry, I'm getting microphone instructions. Yes, I'll try to be a little bit more mindful of that.
Okay, I'm going to assume that a highly controlled facility probably uses state-of-the-art technology. So can you tell me a little bit about is there a new, best state-of-the-art technology that can help with emissions?
I know one thing that we're looking at very closely
Well, let me back up. And you heard some of this previously, but we divide the world of emissions broadly into two types. One are emissions that come out of a stack. We call those point sources. And then emissions that don't come out of a stack. We call those fugitive emissions because they come from lots of different places, leaks and drips and that sort of thing. So the emissions controls that are being used on the stacks, the point sources, are already pretty good. And one thing we're looking at is could they be made better? And the answer is probably yes. But that better would be an incremental improvement, not a step change improvement.
Okay, thank you.
Well, just with regard to fugitives, and I didn't get to my main point, that's really where the opportunity is here because there are a lot of technologies that aren't being applied at the facility and a lot of developing technologies. This is an issue not just for commercial sterilizers, but a lot of other kind of emitting sources. So from our purposes, we're taking a very hard look at ways that we can better control those types of emissions.
Okay, I guess what I'm kind of getting at, when we talk about newest and best technology, is there going to be a requirement that if Sterigenics, if it opened, would it be required to use newest and best technology, even if they would claim it would be cost prohibitive to do so?
I'll let Director Kim answer that question since you're the one thinking about facility-specific controls.
I guess all I can tell you is this. In the negotiations that I've been involved with concerning the new legislation, that cost has never been raised as an issue.
So I have a few questions here from the list regarding their current permit. Some of them apply to permit renewals and some other stuff too. I think most of them will follow with Director Kim, though Mr. Wareham, you might have some interjections in there as well. So the first question is Sterigenics considered a major source in regards to Title V?
So before I answer any permit questions, I have to caution and say my permit game is not necessarily strong, but I will do the best to answer these. A major source, no, in the connotation that we would have typically for what is considered a major source. Now, having said that, they are currently under one of those Title V Clean Air Act cap permits. So it's a very extensive, very comprehensive permit, but it would not, I think, by the numbers, I don't think it qualifies as a major source. Well, let me just point out that I think the distinction, the idea that a major source is something deserving of more protection and more control than a minor source or what have you. I think that that's something that when you look at the context of what this legislation is calling for and the, both at the federal and certainly at the state level, our view of how we're going to handle ethylene oxide, that has significance, but it's really just something so serious at this point that, as seen by these requirements in the legislation, I feel very good in saying that we're being as strident and as restrictive as we can in terms of trying to properly regulate this particular chemical.
So while they have a Title V permit, and you might need to explain what these standards are so people might understand them a little bit in short words, a sentence or two. Is Sterigenics required to follow NESHAP or to follow the Title V requirements?
That I can answer. So, and Bill can correct me if I get this wrong. NESHAP is the standard. That's the national emission standard for hazardous air pollutants. That is basically the standard which we put into the CAP permit, the Title V permit. So that is an example of a permit containing a regulatory requirement, and that is the vehicle that you are using to make that regulation enforceable. You're using the permit as the enforcement means. Some of the requirements here in the legislation that I talked about, basically those are what I would call self-enforcement. In other words, those are in and of themselves a violation of law, and so they could be enforced just on the face of the legislation. But something like a NESHAP standard, that is something that we put into a permit, and that is the primary means of our enforcement and compliance with that.
Let me just add, Title V permit typically is not a way to impose additional emissions controls on a facility. The purpose of the Title V permit, John alluded to this, is to be a repository, a roadmap of all of the other requirements that apply to the facility under other authorities in the Clean Air Act. So it's not an either-or question as between a Title V permit and an ESHAP. If a facility has a Title V permit and is subject to an ESHAP, those requirements will be written into the permit. But if the facility doesn't have a Title V permit, that doesn't mean it's any less well regulated, because Title V permits typically aren't used to impose obligation on facilities like this.
So according to the current Title V rules, continuous monitoring is a requirement for a major source. Has Sterigenics been doing continuous monitoring to this point?
Well, again, I think by numbers, they do not qualify, and their past operations did not qualify them as a major source, so that requirement was not something that was applicable. But the point would be, per the legislation, I think going forward, take out Sterigenics, a commercial sterilizer in the state of Illinois would be subject to these requirements and would be subject to that kind of requirement.
So in terms of past compliance for something like what we just spoke about, Sterigenics not being treated necessarily as having that requirement before, in their current permit, their CAP permit from the state of Illinois, it actually lists their possible emissions out of their West aeration room at 15.72 tons a year as a possibility. According to Title V, any facility with a possible emissions of 10 tons per year is treated as a major source and is subject to continuous monitoring. Now, is that correct?
As I mentioned before, my permit game is not strong. I don't have a good answer for your question. I certainly can find out. My permit staff is probably, if they're watching this or if they watch this on replay, they're just going to be pulling their hair out over me not being able to answer this effectively. You ask a very good question, and I'm sure we can get you a very good answer, a very straightforward answer.
So, and that leads to the next part here. If they were not held to the continuous monitoring requirements in the past that they were required to, who takes responsibility for that? And what would happen in that situation?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, typically, when somebody doesn't follow rules or regulations or laws, there's some sort of enforcement. If Sterigenics did not do the continuous monitoring because their permit didn't require them to, is it the IEPA who would then?
No, yeah, okay, I understand. I think I understand. Again, my assumption is this. If my permit staff was here, they could probably tell you in very clear terms why that particular requirement is not included in the permit. And I don't believe it's not a matter of oversight, it's a matter of interpretation as to whether or not that would be subject to something. And we're talking about past. We're not talking about present or future, we're talking about past. So I don't have the answer to your question. It's a good question. It builds on your previous question, and I will find out, and I will make sure that we get the answer to you.
So going back to, and this is going to be more directed towards Mr. Wareham here, you had a slide up talking about different rulemaking that had been done with ethylene oxide sterilization, but you missed a rule from 2005 when the exemption of certain area sources from Title V operating programs listed ethylene oxide sterilization as an area source that would be exempt from those Title V rules unless they were considered a major source. In the course of that rulemaking, there were some serious concerns in reading the documents in the papers written about that rulemaking, that when discussing ethylene oxide sterilization plants in particular, that not all of the factors required were taken into account, mainly the economic factors. When you go to regulate this summer, will economic factors be taken into account in regards to the new rules?
Just so I'm clear, are you talking about the Title V exemption, or are you talking about the broader regulation?
I guess it's a two-part question. Can we expect that Title V exemption to go away? Number one, and then number two, in the new rulemaking factors, are you going to use economic factors?
Well, in answer to the first question, as part of the work we're doing on the proposed rule, we're not thinking about the exemption. You know, your question will cause us to think about that a little bit. And there's a whole separate conversation we can have about that, and I'd be happy to talk to you about the reason why that exemption exists and why we exercise it for virtually all of the area source rules, including the ethylene oxide sterilizer rule. More broadly, when we do regulations, cost is considered when we regulate, depending on how we regulate. So in certain situations, we have to prescribe a minimum level of control and then consider cost in deciding whether to go above that level of control. In other situations, we consider cost in the first instance. And so part of what we're exploring in the rulemaking that we're undertaking is which particular legal authority should we be relying on, and then whichever those authorities we're relying on dictates how cost gets considered. But you know, from our purposes, we have to do what Congress told us to do, and our statute is very specific about where we can and where we shouldn't consider cost.
So in that previous rulemaking, it very specifically stated in the EPA's document that while no determination of cost could be made, they still assumed that it would be higher than what would be allowable in terms of affecting the rule. Is that something that you look at, that you just assume it's going to be higher? Will there be actual costs looked at in the rulemaking, or is it just some guess number provided by industry?
Well, again, whether we consider cost depends on which legal authority we rely on, and that hasn't been decided yet. Where we consider cost, we do the cost estimates, because we're not regulating any one individual facility. We regulate all facilities across the country that are, you know, within this industrial area, in this case, commercial sterilizers.
So, when there are violations of the rules, and this might be more of Director Kim, are individuals in the company held responsible?
So, when you were individuals as opposed to the company itself?
Well, sometimes they're one and the same.
Okay, so generally speaking, liability in what you're talking about flows through the permit, and the permit will specify who the owner or operator is. And if you look at the requirements in the Act or the regulations, generally speaking, it is the owner or operator, and that's generally identified on the permit. And you're right, sometimes it's one and the same. If you're talking about a business entity, it's typically the business name that is the subject of an enforcement action. That's not to say in some specific instances that there might not be individual liability. That might typically go maybe more in the criminal vein as opposed to civil enforcement, but it's generally speaking, it's a permit violation, and so that's what we would typically do. Now, not in every instance, but usually.
I have one last, actually, one quick question and one last question. Director Wareham, when these hearings are going to take place for the new rulemaking, can you commit today that there will be hearings that take place in Illinois?
Who wants to see it here?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I'll try. You know,
Don't you get to make that decision?
No.
Who does?
The administrator. But there's a very high degree of interest here. We fully understand that. That's part of why we're here. And, you know, we tend to schedule public hearings in the places that are most impacted. And, you know, so I think it's a very fair request, and we'll take that request back and we'll see what we can do.
When will you have the answer? On behalf of Blue Ridge, I invite you back.
Thank you. We'd be happy to come back.
And then the last one very quickly for Mr. Kim. In regards to the new legislation, one of the things that it discusses is that any regulatory requirements in terms of new equipment or things that the company would have to do in order to reopen would be subject to municipal ordinances. Is that correct?
No, I understand what you're talking about. I think the provision you're talking about is language inserted in the legislation to make sure that you don't have a situation where this gets into a really fine area in terms of legal interpretation, but basically what we're talking about is this. I mentioned before federal preemption and state preemption. It's basically the same thing, one level down. Generally speaking, if you're a home rule community, you can institute and enforce your requirements upon entities within your community. There are some limitations specifically as to environmental things because the courts have found that, I'm getting really knee deep in this, courts have found that the Environmental Protection Act is supposed to be the primary means of environmental enforcement in the state. But the purpose behind that, and the example I always give is, there's a case that basically said that the Illinois EPA issued a permit to a company and said you can operate your air pollution source according to the requirements of our permit. And our permit, when they submitted it to us, they said we want to have a smokestack 50 feet high. And we said that's not violating any requirement, that's fine. Well, there was a local requirement that said stacks can't be any more than 30 feet high. And the question was, well, doesn't your permit that we gave them mean that they don't have to comply with that local requirement? And the answer is no, they have to comply with that local requirement. Even though our permit on the face says 50 feet, if the local ordinance said 30, they had to do that. That's what that language is intended to do, is to make clear that if there are local requirements that are not conflicting with a state requirement, then that local requirement needs to be complied with by the entity.
So if the local building requirements are stricter than the permit, they would have to be enforced?
It's not at all unusual when we issue permits that a permittee tells us we have to go and we have to get a local building permit from the local community before we can actually do the things that your permit allows us to do. So yeah.
I guess it's good we have home rule.
Will the US EPA continue this type of risk assessment for all locations in the US?
No. As I described, we're doing things differently than we usually do them because of the potentially high risk levels we're seeing in certain communities. So the way we would usually address an issue like this is by developing and issuing a nationally applicable regulation. But as I described in my remarks a little while ago, that takes time, and given the potential risk that we're seeing in Willowbrook and other places, we thought the time it would take to put a rule in place was too long, which is why we're doing this, working with the state to do the site-specific work. We focused our site-specific work on a limited number of facilities, and I think the number is 12 or 13 across the country, including Willowbrook. And we created that list based on what we predicted to be the highest risk facilities in the country. So it's a two-pronged strategy, as I described before, where the kind of work we're doing here will be done in a limited number of places, and everywhere else where the risks are relatively lower, we'll rely on the national rulemaking to take care of the problem.
Thank you. One commonality that is being stated by all agencies is that we do not have enough historical data, or that the data is not consistent with the most recent ambient air samples. This, I believe, is due to the fact that companies have the ability to choose their own SIC codes, which allows them the ability to not report emissions of carcinogenic gases. How will the US EPA close this loophole?
Well, in the case of Willowbrook, Ned and Kelly and others have described, part of the work we've done in conjunction with the state of Illinois to look at this particular facility is to gather site-specific information. So we're not relying in total. We're relying in part on information provided by the facility, but certainly not in total by the information provided by the facility. So in this particular case, those potential limitations on national reporting simply are not applicable because we have site-specific information. When we do the national rulemaking, there's a similar answer. And we like to have complete information on all of the facilities we regulate, but it's rarely the case that we do. So we
gather as much representative information as we can, but part of our job when we do national regulations is to validate that information, so we go to pretty great lengths to make sure that the information we have is in fact valid and credible and usable for regulatory purposes. Because if we don't do that, people can challenge our rules and our rules get overturned, so it's a really important thing for us.
Yeah, so I understand what you're saying, but they're able to choose their own SIG codes, and if they're not able to, if they are able to choose one that allows them to not report, all of this is meaningless. All of this is meaningless because we will not get the reports that are needed to make sure that they're not emitting toxic gas that is killing the communities all across the nation. So we need to close that loophole, and we need to make sure that when they have a TRI chemical in their facility that they're emitting, it needs to be reported no matter what. They can't say that they're an orthopedic maker, orthopedic prosthetic maker.
Or shipping and handling.
Or shipping and handling. They need to be regulated because of the chemicals that they release.
So TRI, my office is responsible for a lot of things, but we're not responsible for TRI, so what I can do is take that back to the people who actually implement that particular requirement.
Thank you. Has the state of Illinois established an ambient air quality standard for EO?
No.
Is there a federal ambient standard?
I'm sorry, say again?
Is there a federal ambient air standard? Same
Nope.
question. No. What type of health effects does EO cause at intermediate concentrations? I know that's probably more of a Sue Buchanan question.
What do you mean by intermediate concentrations?
Intermediate, so it's just small acute concentrations.
Say that again?
Low level.
Low level? Well, ethylene oxide is a carcinogen. We don't expect it to cause other health effects at low levels. We don't have the data that show any other types of health effects at low levels, even with chronic exposures. But as we know with cancer, the more the exposure, the higher the risk.
Okay. So with high concentrations, obviously cancer, death, there's headaches, there's nausea, there's stuff like that. And as Captain Coolidge stated, EO is not naturally found in the environment, correct?
Right.
Okay. And as far as we know, there are no other sources of emitters of EO?
So we are still looking at potential other sources of ethylene oxide. We're generally taking a measurement-based approach. We know from the data we've collected in Willowbrook and similar monitoring data in Colorado, in Michigan, that there are low yet measurable levels that are not clearly linked to any particular sources. So it's something we need to look at closer. One of the things that we're going to do is to analyze samples from existing, not new, but existing air toxics monitors around the country. And when we have some of that information and other information about potential sources, we'll come back and talk with folks about that. Could be a good topic for the follow-up webinar we mentioned earlier.
Great, thank you. In 2006, US EPA and Illinois EPA filed a complaint alleging that Pentex Resources and Brex Energy were presenting an imminent and substantial endangerment to the public health and welfare of the environment within the Section 303 of the Clean Air Act due to emissions of hydrogen sulfide, a VOC, a non-group 1 carcinogen that had no ambient air quality standards that caused intermediate health effects. The US EPA acknowledged that hydrogen sulfide was found naturally in the environment, therefore the companies could no longer contribute to releasing more into the air. Why then are you not taking the same approach for Sterigenics, and since it's not even naturally found in the air? This is a case that you guys all were involved in.
Well, the agency as a whole may have been involved, but I wasn't, so I don't know anything about that particular order, so I can't answer your question. Maybe John does.
Yeah, I apologize. I don't know the particulars of that case, so I can't really give you a good answer.
I believe we have a copy here. We'll be more than happy to give it to you. Sure. But the fact that they were, this company complied to fixing what was needed because of the emissions of a naturally released gas, and we're not doing the same here, is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Kelly, is there a way that you can put up that slide? It was stated today that the emissions goes up to 20 to 25 miles. This encompasses 100 schools, businesses, almost all of the eastern part of Illinois. US EPA created this risk assessment. How will the Environment Protection Agency protect all the constituents within Illinois? Because when we look at this map, it's a lot different than that little blob that was presented before. This is 25 miles out. It goes up to Schaumburg, it goes up to Chicago, St. Charles. This affects everybody.
And just so I understand what we're looking at, what does that circle represent?
25 miles.
Okay, but what level of exposure does that represent?
1
in a million?
Yes.
Okay.
At the 25 mile mark.
Right. So a lot of what Kelly talked about during your presentation is what we presented in the slides were the levels of the way she answered the question a little bit differently than I would. The question was why did you only show levels out to 100 in a million? And my answer would be below 100 in a million under our regulatory construct. That's a level that's presumptively safe. And that doesn't end the analysis. When we see levels that high, we still have to do further analysis, considering cost, because Congress said so, as to whether additional emission controls are needed. So we care about emissions all the way down to 1 in a million. Below 1 in a million, we lose our regulatory authority because that's presumptively safe enough that no further regulation is needed according to Congress. So from our perspective, what's most important is to solve the issue where it's 100 parts per million, or 100 in a million or above, because one, those are the highest levels of risk that would be actionable from a regulatory standpoint. And two, those are the levels of risk that are being seen in this community according to the risk assessment that we've done. If we address that adequately, then what you see in the larger circle will also improve, and probably improve significantly, because the reductions needed to get the local risk under control will have the collateral effect of further reducing everybody's exposure.
With Sterigenics, then you combine Vantage, then you combine Medline, and if Sterigenics is correct with all the trucks, this is a health crisis that needs to be stopped. We can no longer emit more ethylene oxide into our society, and that is the end of, the end of the sentence. That's the end of the game. We should not be emitting any more ethylene oxide into our air that is already out there. I have one last question. With all this new data that has come out with the new risk assessment and everything else, how can this community sue the EPA for not protecting the people? Under what section are we able to sue you for not protecting the people?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last of what you said.
Under what section are we able to sue the EPA for not doing their jobs and protecting the people? You guys warned Sterigenics in 2017. They put the scrubbers on in 2018. You knew it then. You started testing then. And we're still in this situation where they just have a seal order, a temporary seal order, where they should be closed.
Yes, permanently. They knew.
So under what section can we sue the EPA?
Well, I can tell you have the opportunity to challenge any regulatory decision that we make. Beyond that, I wouldn't know the answer to your question. In my experience, we haven't.
Does anybody in this crowd know this answer?
Director Kim did run the legal department at the IEPA. He might know.
Yeah, but I would challenge the predicate, and as some of us talked about before, this started in 2016, and not the emissions and not the potential risk, but
1984. Thank you.
right. But what changed? Why are we having this conversation right now? It's because
EPA scientists in our Office of Research and Development looked at the newest science available and concluded in 2016 that ethylene oxide is more potent than we ever thought it was.
I'm going to interrupt you.
No, don't interrupt me.
Yeah.
That's good, because that means, you know, as we should as an agency, we follow the current science and we update our science as that becomes necessary, and that's exactly what happened here. Right, but it's bad because, you know, what we've heard repeatedly tonight and what we've heard repeatedly in the prior meetings and in individual conversations that we've had with many of you is that doesn't solve at all the fact that there's been exposure going back 10, 20, 30 years. This facility has been in the community for a long, long time. And we hear you. We understand exactly what you're saying. And based on current information, there are very, very, very high levels of risk.
Okay, we're running out of time and I haven't even started yet. Okay, so in 2016, you realized how dangerous this chemical was. Yet, to this day, you still haven't set regulations. Am I hearing that correct?
That's correct.
And in 2016, you realized how dangerous this chemical was, and you've not had another risk assessment done since then, correct? Residual risk assessment.
I mean, part of the purpose of tonight's meeting is to present the results of the Willowbrook risk assessment.
Okay, I'm talking about the future regulations that you're going to have out in the summer. Is that going to include residual risk?
We are going to consider risk. You absolutely will.
And is that risk to the health of the people?
Of course, human health.
And what are you going to use to consider that?
Not sure
What information, what data are you going to use to determine residual risk?
Well, it's all the sorts of things that Kelly talked about earlier. We got to look at levels of emissions. We have to look at local weather. We have to look at where people live and how many people live there. I think you're questioning, are we going to use the latest IRIS assessment or something different? And the answer is we're going to use the latest IRIS assessment because that's the best science we have available.
Okay, so this regulation is not just a technology review?
Well, I said earlier that we're deliberating what the right legal authority should be to do this regulation. And one of the legal authorities available to us is what you just referred to. 112D6 of the Clean Air Act requires us to do a periodic technology review of these kind of standards. That's something we might do. You know, something else we're talking about is maybe we just redo the residual risk standard itself. And since you've obviously been looking at the Act under 112F, which is what gives us authority and obligation to look at residual risk, as you're using that term. So there are pros and cons with both of those things. We're in an unusual situation, so part of the, one of the really important issues we're going to talk about in the proposed rule is what is the right legal authority to use here.
So if the residual risk review shows numbers similar to what we have here, is that going to be updated, that regulation?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so, therefore, the standards would then be revised to address the risk.
Correct.
And in that case, the cost of any modifications that are required will not be taken into account. Is that correct?
Well, it depends. I mean, that's one of the important things about the authority that we rely on. So in 112D6, the technology review, cost is a consideration. And even if we consider cost in the first instance, one of the important questions we have to ask is what would we consider acceptable levels of cost? And for certain types of highly potent pollutants like mercury, we impose much greater cost to get emissions reductions than we might for much less potent pollutants like whatever else. So again, that's one of the questions that we would have to ask if we go down 112D6. If we go down to 112F, the residual risk analysis, then we do a tiered analysis. I'm sorry, you ask a complicated question, so you get a complicated answer. And for risks above 100 million, and I told you a second ago, we focus in particular on risks above 100 million because from a regulatory standpoint, those risks are high enough that they require us to take action regardless of cost, and then we consider cost later in the analysis. So again, these are very fundamental and important issues, and they're
things that we're debating in very real time as we put this proposed rule together.
Does the US EPA have the authority to completely shut Sterigenics down permanently?
Likely not.
And in what instance would they?
Well, and remember, I said a little bit while ago, we manage risk. We don't have authority to eliminate risk. That's not something we do under the Clean Air Act. That's not something Congress lets us do. If Congress required us to eliminate risk, we'd shut down vast swaths of the U.S. economy, because just about everything that's done, certainly if on the industrial front, creates some kind of risk for somebody. So our mission under this part of the act is to reduce emissions to levels of risk that Congress has said are seen as generally acceptable in the population, and that's what we do.
Okay, my last question for you is, you mentioned a short while ago that below 100 in a million, you lose your regulatory authority. So why did you not take action against Sterigenics in February when the numbers were sky high?
I'm sorry, you threw me for a loop. So first, because I didn't say we lose our regulatory authority changes when your level's below 100 in a million. And what I just said a second ago is if we see numbers above 100 in a million, we have to act. We must do something.
Why didn't you?
But you've done nothing.
But yes, we have. We're working on a regulation, and I told you, regulations take months or years, and we knew going into this that was too long. And that's why we're here tonight. That's why we're here in conjunction with the state of Illinois.
No, my question is, why did you not take any action against Sterigenics directly when those levels were so high?
Right, because again, we told you at the beginning, we do things deliberatively. And step one of this process has been to gather the best information we can, do the best analysis we can, to characterize the risk as best we can, to inform decision making. And I said earlier in the meeting that we're reaching the end of that phase, and it seems like a long time to you, and I fully understand that, but you know, what we've done, and not me, I mean, what these people have done, what John's people have done, is a tremendous amount of very good work in a very short period of time, given the time frames we work on in regulation. And we now are in a position to make very good decisions about what has to happen next. So we don't go off half-cocked. You know, our reaction is not to shut people down, you know, shoot first and ask questions later. That's not what we do. We make fact-based, risk-based decisions, and you're seeing the product of a very good analysis here tonight that says something must be done. And the state is working on things, we're working on national regulations, and we're going to get results.
All right, well, we'll talk to you about that in the summer then. Before I get to Director Kim, I wanted to ask Kathy Stepp a question, because you have made it into the media in recent months. And we are very interested in knowing whether there's any truth to the allegations that employees of Region 5 were instructed not to inspect any ethylene oxide emission, or companies that emit ethylene oxide in Region 5.
100% untrue.
Was an investigation undertaken internally to make sure that wasn't done?
Well, I thought you were asking me if I did that.
I'm asking Region 5,
absolutely
period.
did not do that.
Okay, so you did not instruct anybody to do that?
No, myself, my management team, I've got my Air Division Director here who can also attest to the same thing. Of course we wouldn't do that.
And was there an internal investigation undertaken to ensure that no one on the management level instructed any of the employees not to inspect the facilities?
There was allegations made. I'm not sure if the IG was pursuing that direct allegation or not, but I'm telling you, there's absolutely no foundation to it. In fact, I'm hopeful that my being here, my leadership team, as well as a lot of our staff, and the track record that our team has on the work that actually EPA Region 5 did proactively. As soon as we saw the NADA assessment, I think it bears repeating, our staff saw that there could be risk there, and then did the modeling, internal modeling, and then of course took the next step to do monitoring, and then brought it to the attention of headquarters and Bill's shop, and that's one of the things that started all this, along with our reaching out to our partners at ATSDR. So I'm very proud actually of the work our Region 5 team did, because without them being proactive, we wouldn't have known soon enough, or as soon as we do. But I appreciate being able to address that allegation. It's unfounded.
Thank you.
So Margie, I'm going to give you the rest of the time at 10 o'clock. You got about 5 more minutes.
Okay. Director Kim.
Thought you were out of time.
No, I've got time for you.
Kidding.
Is the Illinois EPA going to set regulations for emissions of ethylene oxide?
Well, we are required to promulgate, well, we most likely will be required to propose certain rules that I described for you before related to ambient air monitoring. Beyond that, the reason that our state, and I think I speak for pretty much all states, the reason we typically do not do that kind of exercise is really a resource issue. We don't have the resources and the data and the background to promulgate rules like that. Now, I've been involved going way back in one situation where we did decide to undertake a state-specific rule that was going to be different than a federal rule, a substantive emission limit that you're talking about. And to do that, we had to hire, I think, 3 or 4 outside people to come in. It was a 2-year exercise, 2.5-year exercise. It's a big undertaking for a state to do, simply because from a resource standpoint, it's much more difficult. That's why, generally speaking, states look to the federal government for those emission standards or for those national standards. Not to say that, for example, like with the legislation, there aren't certain tweaks that the states might do to try and address maybe state-specific type concerns, or perhaps, you know, from a permitting standpoint, we might tailor a permit specifically towards a particular facility's operations. But
So no regulation statewide?
We don't have anything planned,
facility.
no.
Okay. Question. You talked a lot about what the legislation states that is going through the session right now. And the question to you is, how can you justify setbacks for schools for new facilities, but you're okay with Sterigenics being within 1 mile of 3 schools? Half mile. And so you know, the setbacks that are in the legislation are 10 miles and 15 miles away.
As I mentioned before, our agency is responsible for drafting certain portions of this legislation. That is not something we drafted, and I honestly don't know what the rationale was or the specific thought was behind that language. I don't know.
Is the okay with it?
Did lobbyists draft it?
I honestly don't know who drafted it.
But are you okay with it?
But are you okay with it being your school? Do you think that's appropriate?
The question is, do you think it's appropriate for this facility to be that close to a school?
Yeah, again, I guess I'm a little confused. Are we talking about the location of Sterigenics?
Yeah. Is it okay with you that Sterigenics is within a half
so
mile?
my understanding is, and I don't know the exact distances, I don't believe if this legislation was applicable to Sterigenics that they would be situated where they are. Now, I could be wrong on that because I haven't measured it out.
But are they going to be grandfathered in? Are they going to be grandfathered in where it doesn't apply to them? Because they're existing.
Right. It is. The way the legislation is set up, it only applies if a new entity is coming in for a new permit, then they have to comply with these setback requirements.
Are you okay with that?
Okay.
Okay, I need to get my questions back, please.
She's only got a little bit of time left to answer,
Okay.
ask her question.
But this is the most important.
So Margie, if you want to follow up on that, please do.
Yeah. So you say new permit, you mean new facility. So Sterigenics renewing their permit, will that require them to be 10 miles away from a school?
No, I believe the way the legislation is written, the intention was for new sources, not for existing sources. Because I believe, yes, the intention of the legislation is to, at least as to the location part of that, I believe it is to, let's put it this way, there's no language that does not do, that excludes them. So they would be grandfathered in on that. The other requirements would be applicable, but I believe as to the location, they would be grandfathered in is my guess. Now, I that's just my quick read of it. I don't know what the, I'm just reading, this is a section that I don't have particular knowledge of.
But you said you negotiated with them as part of this. So
I said we
okay
negotiated.
with this?
We negotiated, we were involved with all the parties that were talking about this stuff. There are certain provisions that we did draft, and the provisions that we drafted were related to the modeling, to the emissions testing, to the stack testing, and to the capture and control. The setback requirements is not something that we drafted, and it's not something we negotiated.
Okay.
All right, I have to go to my next question.
Yep, Margie, you have time for one more question. 10 o'clock.
Okay. So is your plan to, if legislation passes, to lift the seal and let the legislation take over?
I can't, the seal is, again, part of litigation that is separate and apart from the legislation. The legislation stands on its own.
So we're not going to hear, right after legislation passes, that the seal's been lifted?
Whatever's going on with the seal is tied to litigation. That is not the same thing as legislation.
Have they applied to renew their permit yet?
No.
Will you lift the seal before they comply with any new permit regulations?
Again, I cannot talk about anything having to do with the seal order because there are 2 lawsuits that are directly involving all aspects of that seal order. I can't discuss it.
Okay, my last question. If this company manages to control all of their emissions, but an explosion occurs, what impact is that going to have?
Well, that presumes, I don't know what the conditions would be that they would be operating under. And so I don't know what so when you say that they would explode, that presumes they're operating. I don't know what the conditions would be associated with their operation. I don't know, therefore, what the associated risk is or what the associated impact would be from those types of operations and from an explosion. Obviously, any explosion in any facility, in any industrial facility, is a dangerous bad thing. And it doesn't matter how long a facility's been there, how well regulated they are. Any type of incident like that is serious and it's dangerous and it's tragic. And unfortunately, we have those happen in otherwise well-controlled facilities that have nothing to do with what we're talking about here today.
Was ethylene oxide in the silicone plant that just exploded?
Pardon me?
Was there ethylene oxide in the silicone?
No.
So the only thing I want to leave you with is, on behalf of all the community members, we want to make sure that you, yourself, as the director of the Illinois EPA, understands that the only appropriate resolution to the pending litigation is for Sterigenics to permanently shut down. We want to make sure you understand that to your face. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you, presenters. Thank you, panelists. I know this was a really hard meeting for a lot of folks, and I really appreciate your patience and your civility throughout. Mayor Grasso would like to make a final set of comments.
Everyone,
It's not on? So, look, we were here for over 4 hours. Turn around and look at yourselves. You're doing what you're supposed to do and let these people know. John,
Hey folks, just two more minutes. Just share attention, 2 more minutes.
John, Mr. O'Toole, 1 second. I want to leave you, really, as you're going home tonight, think about your loved ones. Because when I hear, I'm a litigator, when I hear you say that you can't talk about the litigation, I'm worried as the leader of this community who wants to join that litigation, and I've asked our lawyers to intervene in that litigation, as has Willowbrook and Darien. You know the concept of self-defense? Well, I feel, and we feel in this community, that we are engaging in our self-defense in that litigation. And you cannot entertain any discussion that settles that case
and allows the seal order to be lifted. From everything we heard tonight, the cancer risks have in fact been accelerated and heightened in this community, and especially for women. And that alone, with all the other qualifiers and all the data, for this particular facility in Willowbrook, it can never open again. Thank you, everyone. Keep up the good fight.
Drive safely, everyone.